Chapter 36 of the Malay Archipelago, Volume 2, by Alfred Russel WALLACE. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 36. Waigiou, July to September 1860. The village of Muka, on the south coast of Waigiou, consists of a number of poor huts, partly in the water and partly on shore, and scattered irregularly over a space of about half a mile in a shallow bay. Around it are a few cultivated patches, and a good deal of second-growth woody vegetation, while behind, at the distance of about half a mile, rises a virgin forest, through which are a few paths to some houses and plantations a mile or two inland. The country round is rather flat, and in places swampy, and there are one or two small streams which run behind the village into the sea behind it. Finding that no house could be had suitable to my purpose, and having so often experienced the advantages of living close to, or just within the forest, I obtained the assistance of half a dozen men, and having selected a spot near the path and the stream, and close to a fine fig tree which stood just within the forest, we cleared the ground and set to building a house. As I did not expect to stay here so long as I had done at Dorey, I built a long, low, narrow shed, about 7 feet high on one side and 4 on the other, which required but little wood and was put up very rapidly. Our sails, with a few old ataps from a deserted hut in the village, formed the walls, and a quantity of cadjans, or palm-leaf mats, covered it on the roof. On the third day my house was finished, and all my things put in and comfortably arranged to begin work, and I was quite pleased at having got established so quickly and in such a nice situation. It had been so far fine weather, but in the night it rained hard, and we found our mat roof would not keep out water. It first began to drop, and then to stream over everything. I had to get up in the middle of the night to secure my insect boxes, rice, and other perishable articles, and to find a dry place to sleep in, for my bed was soaked. Fresh leaks kept forming as the rain continued, and we all passed a very miserable and sleepless night. In the morning the sun shone brightly, and everything was put out to dry. We tried to find out why the mats leaked, and thought we'd discovered that they'd been laid on upside down. Having shifted them all, and got everything dry and comfortable by the evening, we again went to bed, and before midnight were again awoken by a torrent of rain and leaks streaming in upon us as bad as ever. There was no more sleep for us that night, and the next day our roof was again taken to pieces, and we came to the conclusion that the fault was a want of slope enough in the roof for mats, although it would be sufficient for the usual atap thatch. I therefore purchased a few new and some old ataps, and in the parts that these would not cover, we put up mats double, and then at last had the satisfaction of finding our roof tolerably watertight. I was now able to begin working at the natural history of the island. When I first arrived I was surprised at being told that there were no paradise birds at Muka, although there were plenty at Bessir, a place where the natives caught them and prepared the skins. I assured the people I had heard the cry of these birds close to the village, but they would not believe that I could know their cry. However, the very first time I went to the forest, I not only heard, but saw them, and was convinced that there were plenty about, but they were very shy, and it was some time before we got any. My hunter first shot a female, and I, one day, got very close to a fine male. He was, as I expected, the rare red species, Paradise rubra, which alone inhabits this island, and is found nowhere else. He was quite low down, running along a bough, searching for insects, almost like a woodpecker, and the long, black ribbon-like filaments in his tail hung down in the most graceful double curve imaginable. I covered him with my gun, and was going to use the barrel, which had a very small charge of powder and No. 8 shot, so as to not injure his plumage, but the gun missed fire, and he was off in an instant among the thickest jungle. Another day we saw no less than 8 fine males at different times, and fired 4 times at them, but though other birds at the same distance almost always dropped, these all got away, and I began to think that we were not going to get this magnificent species. At length the fruit ripened on the fig tree close by my house, and many birds came to feed on it, and one morning as I was taking my coffee, a male paradise bird was seen to settle on its top. I seized my gun, ran under the tree, and gazing up, could see it flying across from branch to branch, seizing a fruit here and another there, and then, before I could get a sufficient aim to shoot at such a height, for it was one of the loftiest trees in the tropics, it was away into the forest. They now visited the tree every morning, but they stayed so short a time, their motions were so rapid, and it was so difficult to see them, owing to the lower trees which impeded the view, that it was only after several days' watching, and 1 or 2 misses, that I brought down my bird, a male in the most magnificent plumage. This bird differs very much from the two large species which I have already obtained, and although it wants the grace imparted by their long golden trains, is in many respects more remarkable and more beautiful. This bird differs very much from the two large species which I had already obtained, and, although it wants the grace imparted by their long golden trains, is in many respects more remarkable and more beautiful. The head, back, and shoulders are clothed with a richer yellow, the deep metallic green colour of the throat extends further over the head, and the feathers are elongated on the forehead into two little erectile crests. The side plumes are shorter, but are of a rich red colour, terminating in delicate white points, and the middle tail feathers are represented by two long, rigid, glossy ribbons, which are black, thin, and semi-cylindrical, and droop gracefully in a spiral curve. Several other interesting birds were obtained, and about half a dozen quite new ones, but none of any remarkable beauty, except for the lovely little dove, Ptilonopus pulchellus, which with several other pigeons I shot on the same fig tree close to my house. It is of a beautiful green colour above, with a forehead of the richest crimson, while beneath it is ashy white and rich yellow, banded with violet red. On the evening of our arrival at Muka, I observed what appeared like a display of aurora borealis, though I could hardly believe that this was possible at a point a little south of the equator. The night was clear and calm, and the northern sky presented a diffused light with a constant succession of faint vertical flashings or flickerings, exactly similar to an ordinary aurora in England. The next day was fine, but after that the weather was unprecedentedly bad, considering that it ought to have been the dry monsoon. For near a month we had wet weather, the sun either not appearing at all, or only for an hour or two about noon. Morning and evening, as well as nearly all night, it rained or drizzled, and boisterous winds with dark clouds formed the daily programme. With the exception that it was never cold, it was just such weather as a very bad English November or February. The people of Waigiou are not truly indigenes of the island, which possesses no Alfuros or aboriginal inhabitants. They appear to be a mixed race, partly from Gilolo, partly from New Guinea. Malays and Alfuros from the former island have settled here, and many of them taken Papuan wives from Salwati or Dori, while the influx of people from these places, and of slaves, has led to the formation of a tribe exhibiting almost all the transitions from a nearly pure Malayan to an entirely Papuan type. The language spoken by them is entirely Papuan, being that which is used on all the coasts of Mysol, Salwati, the northwest of New Guinea, and the islands of the Greek Gilvik Bay, a fact which indicates the way in which the coast settlements have been formed. The fact that so many of the islands between New Guinea and Moluccas, such as Waigiou, Guebe, Popa, Obi, Batchian, as well as the south and east peninsulas of Gilolo, possess no aboriginal tribes, but are inhabited by people who are evidently mongrels and wanderers, is a remarkable corroborative proof of the distinctness of the Malayan and Papuan races, and of the separation of the geographical areas they inhabit. If these two great races were direct modifications, the one of the other, we should expect to find in the intervening region some homogeneous indigenous race, presenting intermediate characters. For example, between the whitest inhabitants of Europe and the black Klings of South India, there are in the intervening districts homogeneous races which form a gradual transition from one to the other, while in America, although there is a perfect transition from the Anglo-Saxon to the Negro, and from the Spaniard to the Indian, there is no homogeneous race forming a natural transition from one to the other. In the Malay Archipelago we have an excellent example of two absolutely distinct races which appear to have approached each other and intermingled in an unoccupied territory at a very recent epoch in the history of man, and I feel satisfied that no unprejudiced person could study them on the spot without being convinced that this is the true solution of the problem, rather than the almost universally accepted view that they are but modifications of one and the same race. The people of Muka live in that abject state of poverty that is almost always found where the sago tree is abundant. Very few of them take the trouble to plant any vegetables or fruit, but live almost entirely on sago and fish, selling a little tripang or tortoiseshell to buy the scanty clothing they require. Almost all of them, however, possess one or more Papuan slaves, on whose labour they live in almost absolute idleness, just going out on little fishing or trading excursions as an excitement in their monotonous existence. They are under the rule of the Sultan of Tidora, and every year have to pay a small tribute of paradise birds, tortoiseshell or sago. To obtain these, they go in the fine season on a trading voyage to the mainland of New Guinea, and getting a few goods on credit from some Ceram or Bugis trader, make hard bargains with the natives, and gain enough to pay their tribute, and leave a little profit for themselves. Such a country is not a very pleasant one to live in, for as there are no superfluities, there is nothing to sell, and had it not been for a trader from Ceram who was residing there during my stay, who had a small vegetable garden, and whose men occasionally got a few spare fish, I should have often had nothing to eat. Fowls, fruit, and vegetables are luxuries very rarely to be purchased at Muka, and even coconuts, so indispensable for Eastern cookery, are not to be obtained, for though there are some hundreds of trees in the village, all the fruit is eaten green, to supply the place of the vegetables the people are too lazy to cultivate. Without eggs, coconuts, or plantains, we had very short commons, and the boisterous weather being unpropitious for fishing, we had to live on what few edible birds we could shoot, with an occasional couscous, or eastern opossum, the only quadruped except pigs inhabiting the island. I had only shot 2 male paradises on my tree when they ceased visiting it, either owing to the fruit becoming scarce, or that they were wise enough to note there was danger. We continued to hear and see them in the forest, but after a month had not succeeded in shooting any more, and as my chief object in visiting Waigiou was to get these birds, I determined to go to Bessir, where there are a number of Papuans who catch and preserve them. I hired a small outrigger boat for this journey, and left one of my men to guard my house and goods. We had to wait several days for fine weather, and at length started early one morning, and arrived late at night, after a rough and disagreeable passage. The village of Bessir was built in the water, at a point of a small island. The chief food of the people was evidently shellfish, since great heaps of the shells had accumulated in the shallow water between the houses and the land, forming a regular kitchen midden for the exploration of some future archaeologist. We spent the night in the chief's house, and the next morning went over to the mainland to look for a place where I could reside. This part of Waigiou is really another island to the south of the narrow channel we had passed through in coming to Muka. It appears to consist almost entirely of raised coral, whereas the northern island contains hard crystalline rocks. The shores were a range of low limestone cliffs worn out by the water, so that the upper part generally overhung. At distant intervals were little coves and openings, where small streams came down from the interior, and in one of these we landed, pulling our boats up on a patch of white sandy beach. Immediately above was a large newly made plantation of yams and plantains, and a small hut which the chief said we might have the use of, if it would do for me. It was quite a dwarf's house, just 8 feet square, raised on posts so that the floor was 4.5 feet above the ground, and the highest part of the ridge only 5 feet above the floor. As I am 6 feet and an inch in my stockings, I looked at this with some dismay, but finding that the other houses were much further from the water, were dreadfully dirty, and were crowded with people, I at once accepted the little one, and determined to make the best of it. At first I thought of taking out the floor, which would leave it high enough to walk in and out without stooping, but then there would not be room enough, so I left it just as it was, had it thoroughly cleaned out, and brought up my baggage. The upper story I used for sleeping in, and as a store room. In the lower part, which was quite open all round, I fixed up a small table, arranged my boxes, put up hanging shelves, laid a mat on the ground with my wicker chair upon it, hung up another mat on the windward side, and then found that, by bending double and carefully creeping in, I could sit on my chair with my head just clear of the ceiling. Here I lived pretty comfortably for 6 weeks, taking all my meals and doing all my work at my little table, and to and from which I had to creep in a semi-horizontal position a dozen times a day. And after a few severe knocks on the head by suddenly rising from my chair, learned to accommodate myself to circumstances. We put up a little sloping cooking hut outside, and a bench on which my lads could skin their birds. At night I went up to my little loft. They spread their mats on the floor below, and we none of us grumbled at our lodgings. My first business was to send for the men who were accustomed to catch the birds of paradise. Several came, and I showed them my hatchets, beads, knives, and handkerchiefs, and explained to them, as well as I could by signs, the price I would give them for fresh killed specimens. It is the universal custom to pay for everything in advance, but only one man ventured on this occasion to take goods to the value of 2 birds. The rest were suspicious, and wanted to see the result of the first bargain with the strange white man, the only one who had ever come to their island. After 3 days my man brought me the first bird, a very fine specimen, and alive, but tied up in a small bag, and consequently its tail and wing feathers very much crushed and injured. I tried to explain to him and the others that came with him that I wanted them as perfect as possible, and that they should either kill them or keep them on a perch with a string to their leg. As they were now apparently satisfied that all was fair, and that I had no ulterior designs upon them, 6 others took away goods, some for 1 bird, some for more, and one for as many as 6. They said that they had to go a long way for them, and that they would come back as soon as they caught any. At intervals, at about a few days or a week, some of them would return, bringing me 1 or more birds. But though they did not bring any more in bags, there was not much improvement in their condition. As they caught them a long way off in the forest, they would scarcely ever come with one, but would tie it by the leg to a stick and put it in their house till they caught another. The poor creature would make violent efforts to escape, would get among the ashes, or hang suspended by the legs till the limb was swollen and half putrefied, and sometimes die of starvation and worry. One had its beautiful head all defiled by pitch from a damper torch. Another had been so long dead that its stomach was turning green. Luckily, however, the skin and plumage of these birds is so firm and strong that they bear washing and cleaning better than most any other sort, and I was generally able to clean them so well that they did not perceptibly differ from those I had shot myself. Some few were brought me the same day they were caught, and I had an opportunity of examining them in all their beauty and vivacity. As soon as I found they were generally brought alive, I set one of my men to make a large bamboo cage with troughs for food and water, hoping to be able to keep some of them. I got the natives to bring me branches of a fruit that they were very fond of, and I was pleased to find they ate it greedily, and would also take any number of live grasshoppers I gave them, stripping off the legs and wings, and then swallowing them. They drank plenty of water, and were in constant motion, jumping about the cage from perch to perch, clinging on the top and sides, and rarely resting a moment the first day till nightfall. The second day they were always less active, although they would eat as freely as before, and on the morning of the third day they were almost always found dead at the bottom of the cage, without any apparent cause. Some of them ate boiled rice as well as fruit and insects, but after trying many in succession, not 1 out of 10 lived more than 3 days. The second or third day they would be dull, and in several cases they were seized with convulsions, and fell off the perch, dying a few hours afterwards. I tried immature as well as full-plumaged birds, but with no success, and at length gave it up as a hopeless task, and confined my attention to preserving specimens in as good condition as possible. The red birds of paradise are not shot with blunt arrows, as in the Aru Islands and some parts of New Guinea, but are snared in a very ingenious manner. A large climbing arum bears a red reticulated fruit, of which the birds are very fond. The hunters fasten this fruit on a stout forked stick, and provide themselves with a fine but strong cord. They then seek out some tree in the forest, on which the birds are accustomed to perch, and climbing up it, fasten the stick to a branch and arrange the cord in a noose so ingeniously that when the bird comes to eat the fruit its legs are caught, and by pulling the end of the cord, which hangs down on the ground, it comes free from the branch and brings down the bird. Sometimes, when food is abundant elsewhere, the hunter sits from morning till night under his tree with the cord in his hand, and even for 2 or 3 whole days in succession, without even getting a bite, while on the other hand, if very lucky, he may get 2 or 3 birds in a day. There are only 8 or 10 men at Bessir who practice this art, which is unknown elsewhere in the island. I determined, therefore, to stay as long as possible, as my only chance of getting a good series of specimens, and although I was nearly starved, everything eatable by civilized man being scarce, or altogether absent, I finally succeeded. The vegetables and fruit in the plantations around us did not suffice for the wants of the inhabitants, and were almost always dug up or gathered before they were ripe. It was very rarely we could purchase a little fish. Fowls there were none, and we were reduced to live upon tough pigeons and cockatoos, with our rice and sago, and sometimes we could not get these. Having been already 8 months on this voyage, my stock of all condiments, spices, and butter were exhausted, and I found it impossible to eat sufficient of my tasteless and unpalatable food to support health. I got very thin and weak, and had a curious disease known, I have since heard, as brow ache. Directly after breakfast every morning, an intense pain set in on a small spot on the right temple. It was a severe burning ache, as bad as the worst toothache, and lasted about 2 hours, generally going off at noon. When this finally ceased, I had an attack of fever, which left me so weak and so unable to eat our regular food that I feel sure my life was saved by a couple of tins of soup, which I had long reserved for some such extremity. I used often to go out searching after vegetables, and found a great treasure in a lot of tomato plants run wild, and bearing little fruits about the size of gooseberries. I also boiled up the tops of pumpkin plants and of ferns, by way of greens, and occasionally got a few green papaws. The natives, when hard up for food, live upon a fleshy seaweed, which they boil till it is tender. I tried this also, but found it too salt and bitter to be endured. Towards the end of September, it became absolutely necessary for me to return in order to make our homeward voyage before the end of the east monsoon. Most of the men who had taken payment from me had brought the birds that they had agreed for. One poor fellow had been so unfortunate as not to get one, and he very honestly brought back the axe he had received in advance. Another, who had agreed for 6, brought me the 5th 2 days before I was to start, and went off immediately to the forest again to get the other. He did not return, however, and we loaded our boat, and were just on the point of starting, when he came running down after us, holding up a bird, which he handed to me, saying with great satisfaction, "Now I owe you nothing." These were remarkable and quite unexpected instances of honesty among savages, where it would have been very easy for them to have been dishonest without fear of detection or punishment. The country around Bessir was very hilly and rugged, bristling with jagged and honeycombed coralline rocks, and with curious little chasms and ravines. The paths often passed through these rocky clefts, which in the depths of the forest were gloomy and dark in the extreme, and often full of fine-leaved herbaceous plants and curious blue foliage like Lycopodicia. It was in such places as these that I obtained many of my most beautiful small butterflies, such as Sospita statira and Taxila pulchra, the gorgeous blue Amblypodia hercules, and many others. On the skirts of the plantations I found the handsome blue Deodorex despona, and in the shady woods the lively Lycaena wallacei. Here too I obtained the beautiful Thyca aruna, of the richest orange on the upper side, while below it is intense crimson and glossy black, and a superb specimen of a Here too I obtained the beautiful Thyca aruna, of the richest orange on the upper side, while below it is intense crimson and glossy black, and a superb specimen of a green Ornithoptera, absolutely fresh and perfect, and which still remains one of the glories of my cabinet. My collection of birds, though not very rich in number of species, was yet very interesting. I got another specimen of the rare New Guinea kite, Henicopernis longicauda, and a large new goatsucker, Podarga superciliaris, and a most curious ground pigeon of an entirely new genus, and remarkable for its long and powerful bill, Henicophaps albifrons. I was also much pleased to obtain a fine series of a large fruit pigeon with a protuberance on the bill, Cacophaga tumida, and to ascertain that this was not, as had been hitherto supposed, a sexual character, but was found equally in male and female birds. I collected only 73 species of birds in Waigiou, but 12 of them were entirely new, and many others very rare, and as I brought away with me 24 fine specimens of the Paradisa rubra, I did not regret my visit to the island, although it had by no means answered my expectations. End of chapter 36. Recording by Nicholas Longhurst. Chapter 37 of the Malay Archipelago, Volume 2, by Alfred Russel WALLACE. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Nicholas Longhurst. Chapter 37. Voyage from Waigiou to Ternate, September 29th to November 5th, 1860. I had left the old pilot at Waigiou to take care of my house, and to get the prau into sailing order, to caulk her bottom, and to look after the upper works, thatch and rigging. When I returned I found it nearly ready, and immediately began packing up and preparing for the voyage. Our mainsail had formed one side of the house, but the spanker and jib had been put away in the roof, and on opening them to see if any repairs were wanted, to our horror we found that some rats had made there their nest, and had gnawed through them in 20 places. We had therefore to buy matting and to make new sails, and this delayed us till the 29th of September, when we at length left Waigiou. It took us 4 days before we could get clear of the land, having to pass along narrow straits beset with reefs and shoals, and full of strong currents, so that an unfavourable wind stopped us altogether. One day, when nearly clear, a contrary tide and head wind drove us 10 miles back to our anchorage of the night before. This delay made us afraid of running short of water if we should be becalmed at sea, and we therefore determined, if possible, to touch at the island where our men had been lost, and which lay directly in our proper course. The wind was, however, as usual, contrary, being south-southwest instead of south-southeast, as it should have been at this time of the year, and all we could do was to reach the island of Gaji, where we came to an anchor by moonlight under bare volcanic hills. In the morning we tried to enter a deep bay, at the head of which some Galila fishermen told us there was some water, but a headwind prevented us. For the reward of a handkerchief, however, they took us to the place in their boat, and we filled up our jars and bamboos. We then went round to their camping place on the north coast of the island to try and buy something to eat, but could only get smoked turtle meat, as black and as hard as lumps of coal. A little further on there was a plantation belonging to Guebe people, but under the care of a Papuan slave, and the next morning we got some plantains and a few vegetables in exchange for a handkerchief and some knives. On leaving this place, our anchor had got foul in some rocks or sunken log in very deep water, and after many unsuccessful attempts, we were forced to cut our rattan cable and leave it behind us. We had now only one anchor left. Starting early on the 4th of October, the same south-south wind continued, and we began to fear that we should hardly clear the southern point of Gilolo. The night of the 5th was squally with thunder, but after midnight it got tolerably fair, and we were going along with a light wind and looking out for the coast of Gilolo, which we thought we must be nearing, when we heard a dull roaring sound, like a heavy surf behind us. In a short time the roar increased, and we saw a white line of foam coming on, which rapidly passed us without doing any harm, as our boat rose easily over the wave. At short intervals, 10 or a dozen others overtook us with bleat rapidity, and the sea became perfectly smooth as it was before. I concluded at once that these must be earthquake waves, and on reference to the old voyages, we find that these seas have been long subject to similar phenomena. Dampier encountered them near Mysol in New Guinea, and describes them as follows. We found here some very strange tides that ran in streams, making a great sea and roaring so loud that we could hear them before they came within a mile of us. The sea round about then seemed all broken, and tossed the ship so that she would not answer her helm. These ripplings commonly lasted 10 or 12 minutes, and then the sea became as still and smooth as a mill-pond. We sounded often when in the midst of them, but found no ground, neither could we perceive that they drove us any way. We had in one night several of these tides that came mostly from the west, and the wind being from that quarter, we commonly heard them a long time before they came, and sometimes lowered our topsails, thinking it was a good gust of wind. They were of a great length from north to south, but the breadth not exceeding 200 yards, and they drove a great pace, for though we had little wind to move us, yet these would soon pass away and leave the water very smooth, and just before we encountered them, we met a great swell, but it did not break. Some time afterwards I learned that an earthquake had been felt on the coast of Gilolo the very day that we'd encountered these curious waves. When daylight came, we saw the land of Gilolo a few miles off, but the point was unfortunately a little windward of us. We tried to brace up all we could to round it, but as we approached the shore we got into a strong current setting northward, which carried us so rapidly with it that we found it necessary to stand off again in order to get out of its influence. Sometimes we approached the point a little, and our hopes revived. Then the wind fell, and we drifted slowly away. Night found us in nearly the same position as we had occupied in the morning, so we hung down our anchor with about 15 fathoms of cable to prevent drifting. On the morning of the 7th we were, however, a good way up the coast, and we now thought our only chance would be to get in close inshore, where there might be a return current, and could then row. The prow was heavy, and my men were very poor creatures for work, so that it took us 6 hours to get to the edge of the reef that fringed the shore, and as the wind might any moment blow on to it, our situation was a very dangerous one. Luckily, a short distance off, there was a sandy bay where a small stream stopped the growth of the coral, and by evening we reached this and anchored for the night. Here we found some Galila men shooting deer and pigs, but they could not or would not speak Malay, and we could get little information from them. We found out that along the shore the current changed with the tide, while about a mile out it was always one way and against us, and this gave us some hopes of getting back to the point, from which we were now distant 20 miles. Next morning we found that the Galila men had left before daylight, having perhaps some vague fear of our intentions, and very likely taking me for a pirate. During the morning a boat passed, and the people informed us that at a short distance further towards the point there was a much better harbour, where there were plenty of Galila men, from whom we might probably get some assistance. At 3 in the afternoon, when the current returned, we started, but having a headwind, made slow progress. At dusk we reached the entrance of the harbour, but an eddy and a gust of wind carried us away and out to sea. After sunset there was a land breeze, and we sailed a little to the southeast. It then became calm, and we hung down our anchor about 40 fathoms, to endeavour to counteract the current. But it was of little avail, and in the morning we found ourselves a good way from shore, and just opposite our anchorage of the day before, which we again reached by hard rowing. I gave the men this day to rest and sleep, and the next day, October 10th, we again started at 2 in the morning with a land breeze. I had set them to their oars, and given instructions to keep close in shore, and on no account to go out to sea. I went below, being rather unwell. At daybreak I found to my great astonishment that we were again far off shore, and was told that the wind had gradually turned more ahead, and had carried us out, none of them having the sense to take down the sail and row in shore, or to call me. As soon as it was daylight, we saw that we drifted back, and were again opposite our former anchorage, and for the third time had to row hard to get to it. As we approached the shore, I saw that the current was favourable to us, and we continued down the coast till we were close to the entrance to the lower harbour. Just as we were congratulating ourselves on having at last reached it, a strong south-east squall came on, blowing us back and rendering it impossible for us to enter. Not liking the idea of again returning, I determined on trying to anchor, and succeeded in doing so in very deep water and close to the reefs, but the prevailing winds were such that, should we not hold, we should have no difficulty in getting out to sea. By the time the squall had passed, the current had turned against us, and we expected to have to wait till 4 in the afternoon, when we intended to enter the harbour. Now, however, came the climax of our troubles. The swell produced by the squall made us jerk our cable a good deal, and it suddenly snapped low down in the water. We drifted out to sea, and immediately set our mainsail, but we were now without any anchor, and in a vessel so poorly manned it could not be rowed against the most feeble current or the slightest wind. It would be madness to approach these dangerous shores, except in the most perfect calm. We had also 3 days' food left. It was therefore out of the question making any further attempts to get round the point without assistance, and I at once determined to run the village of Gnai Dilur, about 10 miles further north, where we understood that there was a good harbour, and where we might get provisions and a few more rowers. Hitherto winds and currents had invariably opposed our passage southward, and we might have expected them to be favourable to us now we had turned our bowsprit in an opposite direction. But immediately fell calm, and then after a time a westerly land breeze set in, which would not serve us, and we had to row again for hours, and when night came had not reached the village. We were so fortunate, however, as to find a deep sheltered cove where the water was quite smooth, and we constructed a temporary anchor by filling a sack with stones from our ballast, which, being well secured by a network of rattans, held us safely during the night. The next morning my men went on shore to cut wood suitable for making fresh anchors, and about noon, the current turning in our favour, we proceeded to the village, where we found an excellent and well-protected anchorage. On inquiry, we found that the headmen resided at the Gani, on the western side of the peninsula, and it was necessary to send messengers across, about a half-day's journey, to inform them of my arrival, and to beg them to assist me. I then succeeded in buying a little sago, some dried deer meat, and coconuts, which at once relieved our immediate want of something to eat. At night we found our bag of stones still held us very well, and we slept tranquilly. The next day, October 12th, my men set to work making anchors and oars. The native Malay anchor is ingeniously constructed of a piece of tough forked timber, the fluke being strengthened by twisted rattans binding it to the stem, while the cross-piece is formed of a long flat stone, secured in the same manner. These anchors, when well made, hold exceedingly arm, and, owing to the expense of iron, are almost universally used on the smaller prows. In the afternoon the headmen arrived, and promised me as many rowers as I could put on the prow, and also brought me a few eggs and a little rice, which were very acceptable. On the 14th there was a north wind all day, which would have been invaluable to us a few days earlier, but which was now only tantalizing. On the 16th, all being ready, we started at daybreak with 2 new anchors and 10 rowers, who understood their work. By evening we had come more than halfway to the point, and anchored for the night in a small bay. At 3 in the morning I ordered the anchor up, but the rattan cable parted close to the bottom, having been chafed by rocks, and then we lost our 3rd anchor on this unfortunate voyage. The day was calm, and by noon we passed the southern point of Gilolo, which had delayed us 11 days, whereas the whole voyage during this monsoon should not have occupied more than half that time. Having got round the point, our course was exactly in the opposite direction to what it had been, and now, as usual, the wind changed accordingly, coming from the north and northwest, so that we still had to row every mile up to the village of Gani, which we did not reach till the evening of the 18th. A Bugis trader who was residing there and the Senaji, or chief, were very kind, the former assisting me with a spare anchor and cable and making me a present of some vegetables, and the latter baking fresh sago cakes for my men and giving me a couple of fowls, a bottle of oil, and some pumpkins. As the weather was still very uncertain, I got 4 extra men to accompany me to Ternate, for which place we started on the afternoon of the 20th. We had to keep rowing all night, the land breezes being too weak to enable us to sail against the current. During the afternoon of the 21st we had an hour's fair wind, which soon changed into a heavy squall with rain, and my clumsy men let the mainsail get aback and nearly upset us, tearing the sail, and what was worse, losing an hour's fair wind. The night was calm, and we made very little progress. On the 22nd we had light headwinds. A little before noon we passed, with the assistance of our oars, the Paciencia Straits, the narrowest part of the channel between Batchian and Gilolo. These were well named by the early Portuguese navigators, as the currents are very strong, and there are so many eddies that even with a fair wind, vessels are often quite unable to pass through them. In the afternoon a strong north wind, dead ahead, obliged us to anchor twice. At night it was very calm, and we crept along slowly with oars. On the 23rd we still had the wind ahead, or calms. We then crossed over again to the mainland of Gilolo by the advice of the Gani men, who knew the coast well. Just as we got across, we had another northerly squall with rain, and had to anchor on the edge of the coral reef for the night. I called up my men about 3 in the morning of the 24th, but there was no wind to help us, and we rowed along slowly. At daybreak there was a fair breeze from the south, but it lasted only an hour. All the rest of the day we had nothing but calms, light winds ahead, and squalls, and made very little progress. On the 25th we drifted out to the middle of the channel, but made no progress onward. In the afternoon we sailed and rowed to the south end of the Kaióa, and by midnight reached the village. I determined to stay here a few days to rest and recruit, and in hopes of getting better weather. I bought some onions and other vegetables and plenty of eggs, and my men baked fresh sago cakes. I went daily to my old hunting ground in search of insects, but with very poor success. It was now wet, squally weather, and there appeared a stagnation of insect life. We stayed 5 days, during which time 12 persons died in the village, mostly from simple, intermittent fever, of the treatment of which the natives are quite ignorant. During the whole of this voyage I had suffered greatly from sunburnt lips, owing to having exposed myself on deck all day to look after our safety among the shoals and reefs near Waigiou. The salt in the air so affected them that they would not heal, but became excessively painful, and bled at the slightest touch, and for a long time it was with great difficulty that I could eat at all, being obliged to open my mouth very wide, and put in each mouthful with the greatest caution. I kept them constantly covered with ointment, which was itself very disagreeable, and they caused me almost constant pain for more than a month, as they did not get well till I had returned to Ternate, and was able to remain a week indoors. A boat which had left for Ternate the day after we arrived was obliged to return the next day on account of bad weather. On the 31st we went out to the anchorage at the mouth of the harbour, so as to be ready to start at the first favourable opportunity. On the 1st of November I called up my men at 1 in the morning, and we started with the tide in our favour. Hitherto it had usually been calm at night, but on this occasion we had a strong westerly squall with rain, which turned our prow broadside, and obliged us to anchor. When it had passed we went on rowing all night, but the wind ahead counteracted the current in our favour, and we advanced but little. Soon after sunrise the wind became stronger and more adverse, and as we had a dangerous lee shore which we could not clear, we had to put about and get an offing to the west-south-west. This series of contrary winds and bad weather ever since we started, not having had a single day of fair wind, was very remarkable. My men firmly believed that there was something unlucky in the boat, and told me I ought to have had a certain ceremony gone through before starting, consisting of boring a hole in the bottom and pouring some kind of holy oil through it. It must be remembered that this was the season of the southeast monsoon, and yet we had not had even half a day's southeast wind since we left Waigiou. Contrary winds, squalls, and currents drifted us about the rest of the day at their pleasure. The night was equally squally and changeable, and kept us hard at work, taking in and making sail, and rowing in the intervals. Sunrise on the 2nd found us in the middle of the 10-mile channel between Kaióa and Makian. Squalls and showers succeeded each other during the morning. At noon there was a dead calm, after which a light westerly breeze enabled us to reach a village on the Makian in the evening. Here I bought some pomelos, Citrus decumana, canary nuts, and coffee, and let my men have a night's sleep. The morning of the 3rd was fine, and we rowed slowly along the coast of Makian. The captain of a small prow at anchor, seeing me on deck and guessing who I was, made signals for us to stop, and brought me a letter from Charles Allen, who informed me he had been at Ternate 20 days, and was anxiously awaiting my arrival. This was good news, as I was equally anxious about him, and it cheered up my spirits. A light southerly wind now sprang up, and we thought we were going to have fine weather. It soon changed, however, to its old quarter, the west. Dense clouds gathered over the sky, and in less than half an hour we had the severest squall that we had experienced during our whole voyage. Luckily we had got our great mainsail down in time, or the consequences might have been very serious. It was a regular little hurricane, and my old Bugis steersman began shouting out to Allah ya Allah to preserve us. We could only keep up our jib, which was almost blown to rags, but by carefully handling it kept us before the wind, and the prow behaved very well. Our small boat, purchased at Gani, was towing astern, and soon got full of water, so that it broke away and we saw no more of it. In about an hour the fury of the wind abated a little, and in 2 more we were able to hoist our mainsail, reefed and half-mast high. Towards evening it cleared up and fell calm, and the sea, which had been rather high, soon went down. Not being much of a seaman myself, I had been considerably alarmed, and even the old steersman assured me that he had never been in a worse squall all his life. He was now more than ever confirmed in his opinion of the unluckiness of the boat, and in the efficiency of the holy oil which all Bugis praus had poured through their bottoms. As it was, he imputed our safety and the quick termination of the squall entirely to his own prayers, saying with a laugh, "Yes, that is the way we always do on board our praus. When things are at worst, we stand up and shout out our prayers as loud as we can, and then Tuan Allah helps us." After this it took us 2 days more to reach Ternate, having our usual calms, squalls, and headwinds to the very last, and once having to return back to our anchorage owing to violent gusts of wind just as we were close to the town. Looking at my whole voyage in this vessel, from the time when I had left Goram in May, it will appear that my experience of travel in a native prau have not been encouraging. My first crew ran away, 2 men were lost for a month on a desert island, we were 10 times aground on coral reefs, we lost 4 anchors, the sails were devoured by rats, the small boat was lost astern, we were 38 days on the voyage home, which should have taken 12. We were many times short of food and water. We had no compass, lamp, owing to there not being a drop of oil in Waigiou when we left, and to crown all, during the whole of our voyage from Goram to Ceram, to Waigiou, and then from Waigiou to Ternate, occupying in all 78 days, or only 12 days short of 3 months, all in what was supposed to be the favourable season, we had not one single day of fair wind. We were always close braced up, always struggling against wind, tide, and leeway, and in a vessel that would scarcely sail nearer than 8 points from the wind. Every seaman will admit that my first voyage in my own boat was a most unlucky one. Charles Allen had obtained a tolerable collection of birds and insects at Mysol, but far less than he would have done if I had not been so unfortunate as to miss visiting him. After waiting another week or 2 till he was nearly starved, he returned to Wahai in Ceram, and heard, much to his surprise, that I had left a fortnight before. He was delayed there more than a month before he could get back to the north side of Mysol, which he found a much better locality, but it was not yet the season for the paradise birds, and before he had obtained more than a few of the common sort, the last prau was ready to leave for Ternate, and he was obliged to take the opportunity, as he expected I would be waiting for him there. This concludes the record of my wanderings. I next went to Timor, and afterwards to Boru, Java, and Sumatra, which places have already been described. Charles Allen made a voyage to New Guinea, a short account of which will be given in my next chapter on the birds of paradise. On his return he went to the Sula Islands, and made a very interesting collection, which served to determine the limits of the zoological group of coelebs, as already explained in my chapter on the natural history of the island. His next journey was to Flores and Salor, where he obtained some valuable materials, which I have used in my chapter on the natural history of the Timor group. He afterwards went to Koti, on the east coast of Borneo, from which place I was very anxious to obtain collections, as it was quite a new locality, as far as possible from Sarawak, and I had heard very good accounts of it. On his return thence to Surabaya in Java, he was to have gone to the entirely unknown Sumba or Sandalwood Island. Most unfortunately, however, he was seized with a terrible fever on his arrival at Koti, and after lying there some weeks, was taken to Singapore in a very bad condition, where he arrived after I had left for England. When he recovered, he obtained employment in Singapore, and I lost his services as a collector. The 3 concluding chapters of my work will treat of the birds of paradise, the natural history of the Papuan Islands, and the races of man in the Malay Archipelago. End of chapter 37. Recording by Nicholas Longhurst. Chapter 38 of the Malay Archipelago, Volume 2 by Alfred Russel WALLACE. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Nicholas Longhurst. The Birds of Paradise. As many of my journeys were made with the express object of obtaining specimens of the birds of paradise, and learning something of their habits and distribution, and being, as far as I am aware, the only Englishman who has seen these wonderful birds in their native forests, and obtained specimens of many of them, I propose to give here, in a connected form, the result of my observations and inquiries. When the earliest European voyagers reached the Moluccas in search of cloves and nutmegs, which were then rare and precious spices, they were presented with the dried skins of birds so strange and beautiful as to excite the admiration even of those wealth-seeking rovers. The Malay traders gave them the name of Manuk Dewata, or God's birds, and the Portuguese, finding that they had no feet or wings, and not being able to learn anything authentic about them, called them the Pájaros de Sol, or birds of the sun, while the learned Dutchman, who wrote in Latin, called them Avis paradisus, or paradise bird. John van Linschoten gives these names in 1598, and tells us that no one has seen these birds alive, for they live in the air, always turning towards the sun, and never lighting on the earth till they die, for they have neither feet nor wings, as he adds, may be seen by the birds carried to India, and sometimes to Holland, but being very costly, they were then rarely seen in Europe. More than 100 years later, Mr. William Funnell, who accompanied Dampier and wrote an account of the voyage, saw specimens at Amboyna, and was told that they came to Banda to eat nutmegs, which intoxicated them, and made them fall down senseless, when they were killed by ants. Down to 1760, when Linnaeus named the largest species Paradisea apoda, the footless paradise bird, no perfect specimen had been seen in Europe, and absolutely nothing was known about them. And even now, 100 years later, most books state that they migrate annually to Ternate, Banda, and Amboyna, whereas the fact is that they are as completely unknown in those islands in a wild state as they are in England. Linnaeus was also acquainted with a small species which he named Paradisea regia, the kingbird of paradise, and since then 9 or 10 others have been named, all of which were first described from skins preserved by the savages of New Guinea, and generally more or less imperfect. These are now all known in the Malay Archipelago as Burong Coati, or dead birds, indicating that the Malay traders never saw them alive. The Paradiseidae are a group of moderate-sized birds allied in their structure and habits to crows, starlings, and to the Australian honeysuckers, but they are characterized by extraordinary developments of plumage which are unequalled in any other family of birds. In several species, large tufts of delicate bright-coloured feathers spring from each side of the body beneath the wings, forming trains or fans or shields, and the middle feathers of the tail are often elongated into wires, twisted into fantastic shapes, or adorned with the most brilliant metallic tints. In another set of species, these accessory plumes spring from the head, the back, or the shoulders, while the intensity of colour and of metallic lustre displayed by their plumage is not to be equalled by any other birds, except perhaps the hummingbirds, and is not surpassed even by these. They have been usually classified under 2 distinct families, Paradiseidae and Epimachidae, the latter characterized by long and slender beaks, and supposed to be allied to the hoopoes. But the 2 groups are so closely allied in every essential point of structure and habits that I shall consider them as forming subdivisions of one family. I will now give a short description of each of the known species, and then add some general remarks on their natural history. The great bird of paradise, Paradisea apoda of Linnaeus, It's the largest species known, being generally 17 or 18 inches from the beak to the tip of the tail. The body, wings, and tail of a rich coffee brown, which deepens on the breast to blackish violet or purple brown. The whole top of the head and neck is of an exceedingly delicate straw yellow, the feathers being short and close set so as to resemble plush or velvet. The lower part of the throat, up to the eye, clothed with scaly feathers of an emerald green colour, and with rich metallic gloss, and velvety plumes of a still deeper green extend in a band across the forehead and chin as far as the eye, which is bright yellow. The beak is pale lead blue, and the feet, which are rather large and very strong and well formed, are of a pale ashy pink. The two middle feathers of the tail have no webs, except a very small one at the base and at the extreme tip, forming wire-like cirri, which spread out in an elegant double curve, and vary from 24 to 34 inches long. From each side of the body, beneath the wings, springs a dense tuft of long and delicate plumes, sometimes 2 feet in length, of the most intense golden-orange colour and very glossy, but changing towards the tips into a pale brown. This tuft of plumage can be elevated and spread out at pleasure, so as almost to conceal the body of the bird. These splendid ornaments are entirely confined to the male sex, while the female is really a very plain and ordinary-looking bird of a uniform coffee colour, which never changes. Neither does she possess the long tail wires, nor single yellow or green feather about the head. The young males of the first year exactly resemble the females, so that they can only be distinguished by dissection. The first change is the acquisition of the yellow and green colour on the head and throat, and at the same time the 2 middle tail feathers grow a few inches longer than the rest, but remain webbed on both sides. At a later period, these feathers are replaced by the long bare shafts of the full length, as in the adult bird, but there is still no sign of the magnificent orange side plumes, which later complete the attire of the perfect male. To effect these changes, there must be at least 3 successive moultings, and as the birds were found by me in all stages about the same time, it is probable that they moult only once a year, and that the full plumage is not acquired till the bird is 4 years old. It was long thought that the fine train of feathers was assumed for a short time only at breeding season, but my own experience, as well as the observation of birds of an allied species which I brought home with me, and which lived 2 years in this country, show that the complete plumage is retained during the whole year, except during a short period of moulting, as with other birds. The great bird of paradise is very active and vigorous, and seems to be in constant motion all day long. It is very abundant, small flocks of females and young males being constantly met with, and though the full plumaged birds are less plentiful, their loud cries, which are heard daily, show that they also are very numerous. Their note is wok 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 wok, and is so loud and shrill as to be heard at a great distance, and to form the most prominent and characteristic animal sound in the Aru Islands. The mode of nidification is unknown, but the natives told me that the nest was formed of leaves placed on an ant's nest, or on some projecting limb of a very lofty tree, and they believe that it contains only 1 young bird. The egg is quite unknown, and the natives declared that they had never seen it, and a very high reward offered for one by a Dutch official did not meet with success. They moult about January or February, and in May, when they are in full plumage, the males assemble early in the morning to exhibit themselves in the singular manner already described at page 252. This habit enables the natives to obtain some specimens with comparative ease. As soon as they find that the birds have fled upon a tree on which to assemble, they build a little shelter of palm leaves in a convenient place among the branches, and the hunter ensconces himself in it before daylight, armed with his bow and a number of arrows terminating in a round knob. A boy waits at the foot of the tree, and when the birds come at sunrise, and a sufficient number have assembled, and have begun to dance, the hunter shoots them with his blunt arrow so strongly as to stun the bird, which drops down, and is secured and killed by the boy, without its plumage being injured by a drop of blood. The rest take no notice, and fall one after another, till some of them take the alarm. See frontispiece. The native mode of preserving them is to cut off the wings and feet, and then skin the body up to the beak, taking out the skull. A stout stick is then run up through the specimen, coming out at the mouth. Round this some leaves are stuffed, and the whole is wrapped up in a palm spathe, and dried in the smoky hut. By this plan the head, which is already large, is shrunk up almost to nothing, and the body is much reduced and shortened, and the greatest prominence is given to the flowing plumage. Some of these native skins are very clean, and often have wings and feet left on. Others are dreadfully stained with smoke, and all have a most erroneous idea of the proportions of the living bird. The Paradise apoda, as far as we have any certain knowledge, is confined to the mainland of the Aru Islands, never being found in the smaller islands which surround the central mass. It is certainly not found in any of the parts of New Guinea visited by the Malay and Bugis traders, nor in any of the other islands where birds of paradise are obtained. But this is by no means conclusive evidence, for it is only in certain localities that the natives prepare skins, and in other places the same birds may be abundant without ever becoming known. It is therefore quite possible that the species may inhabit the great southern mass of New Guinea, from which Aru has been separated, while its near ally, which I shall next describe, is confined to the northwestern peninsula. The lesser bird of paradise, Paradise papuana of Bechstein, Le Petit Émeraude of French authors, is a much smaller bird than the preceding, although very similar to it. It differs in its lighter brown colour not becoming darker or purpled on the breast, in the extension of the yellow colour all over the upper part of the back and on the wing coverts, in the lighter yellow of the side plumes, which have only a tinge of orange, and at the tips are nearly pure white, and in the comparative shortness of the tail cirri. The female differs remarkably from the same sex in the Paradise apoda by being entirely white on the undersurface of the body, and is thus a much handsomer bird. The young males are similarly coloured, and as they grow older they change to brown, and go through the same stages in acquiring the perfect plumage as has already been described in the allied species. It is this bird which is most commonly used in ladies' headdresses in this country, and also forms an important article of commerce in the East. The Paradise papuana has a comparatively wide range, being the common species on the mainland of New Guinea, as well as on the islands of Mysol, Salwati, Jobi, Biak, and Sook. On the south coast of New Guinea, the Dutch naturalist Muller found it at the Ternate river in the longitude 136 degrees east. I obtained it myself at Dori, and the captain of the Dutch steamer Etna informed me that he had seen the feathers among the natives of the Humboldt Bay in 141 degrees east longitude. It is very probable, therefore, that it ranges over the whole of the mainland of New Guinea. The true paradise birds are omnivorous, feeding on fruits and insects, of the former preferring the small figs, of the latter grasshoppers, locusts, and phasmas, as well as cockroaches and caterpillars. When I returned home in 1862, I was so fortunate as to find 2 adult males of the species in Singapore, and as they seemed healthy and fed voraciously on rice, bananas, and cockroaches, I determined on giving the high price asked for them, £100, and to bring them to England by the overland route under my own care. On my way home I stayed a week at Bombay to break the journey, and to lay in a fresh stock of bananas for my birds. I had great difficulty, however, in supplying them with insect food, for in the peninsular and oriental steamers cockroaches were scarce, and it was only by setting traps in the storerooms, and by hunting an hour every night in the forecastle, that I could secure a few dozen of these creatures, scarcely enough for a single meal. At Malta, where I stayed a fortnight, I got plenty of cockroaches from a bakehouse, and when I left, took with me several biscuit tins full, as provision for the voyage home. We came through the Mediterranean in March with a very cold wind, and the only place on board the mail steamer where their large cage could be accommodated was exposed to a strong current of air down a hatchway, which stood open day and night, yet the birds never seemed to feel the cold. During the night journey from Marseille to Paris it was a sharp frost, yet they arrived in London in perfect health, and lived in the zoological gardens for 1 and 2 years, often displaying their beautiful plumes to the admiration of the spectators. It is evident, therefore, that the paradise birds are very hardy, and require air and exercise rather than heat, and I feel sure that if a good-sized conservators could be devoted to them, or if they could be turned loose in the tropical department of the Crystal Palace or the great palm house at Kew, they would live in this country for many years. The red bird of paradise, Paradise rubra of Viellot, though allied to the 2 birds already described, is much more distinct from them than they are from each other. It is about the same size as the Paradise papuana, 13 to 14 inches long, but differs from it in many particulars. The side plumes, instead of being yellow, are rich crimson, and only extend about 3 or 4 inches beyond the end of the tail. They are somewhat rigid, and the ends are curved downwards and inwards, and are tipped with white. The 2 middle tail feathers, instead of being simply elongated and deprived of the webs, are transformed into stiff black ribbons, 1/4 of an inch wide, but curved like a split quill, and resembling thin half-cylinders of horn or whalebone. When a dead bird is laid on its back, it is seen that these ribbons take a curve or set, which brings them round so as to meet the double circle on the neck of the bird. but when they hang downwards during life, they assume a spiral twist and form an exceedingly graceful double curve. They are about 22 inches long, and always attract attention as the most conspicuous and extraordinary feature of the species. The rich metallic green colour of the throat extends over the front half of the head to behind the eyes, and on the forehead forms a little doublet crest of scaly feathers, which adds much to the vivacity of the bird's aspect. The bill is gambage yellow, and the iris blackish olive. Figure at page 353. The female of the species is of a tolerably uniform coffee-brown colour, but has a blackish head and the nape neck and shoulders yellow, indicating the position of the brighter colours of the male. The changes of plumage follow the same order of succession as in the other species, the bright colours of the head and neck being first developed, then the lengthened filaments of the tail, and last of all the red side plumes. I obtained a series of specimens, illustrating the manner in which the extraordinary black tail ribbons are developed, which is very remarkable. They first appear as two ordinary feathers, rather shorter than the rest of the tail. The second stage would no doubt be that, shown in a specimen of Paradisea apoda, in which the feathers are moderately lengthened, and with the web narrowed in the middle. The third stage is shown by a specimen which has part of the midrib bare, and terminated by a spatulate web. In another, the bare midrib is a little dilated and semi-cylindrical, and the terminal web very small. In a fifth, the perfect black horny riband is formed, but it bears at its extremity a brown spatulate web, while in another portion of the black riband itself bears, for a portion of its length, a narrow brown web. It is only after these changes are fully completed that the red side plumes begin to appear. The successive stages of development of the colours and plumage of the birds of paradise are very interesting, from the striking manner in which they accord with the theory of their having been produced by the simple action of variation, and the cumulative power of selection by the females of those male birds which were more than usually ornamental. Variations of colour are, of all others, the most frequent and most striking, and are most easily modified and accumulated by man's selection of them. We should expect, therefore, that the sexual differences of colour would be those most early accumulated and fixed, and would therefore appear soonest in the young birds. And this is exactly what occurs in the paradise birds. Of all the variations in the form of the bird's feathers, none are so frequent as those in the head and tail. These occur more or less in every family of birds, and are easily produced in many domesticated varieties, while unusual developments of the feathers of the body are rare in a whole class of birds, and have seldom or never occurred in domesticated species. In accordance with these facts, we find the scale-formed plumes of the throat, the crests of the head, and the long cirri of the tail, all fully developed before the plumes which spring from the side of the body begin to make their appearance. If, on the other hand, the male paradise birds have not acquired their distinctive plumage by successive variations, but have been as they are now from the moment they first appeared upon the earth, this succession becomes the least unintelligible to us, for we can see no reason why the changes should not take place simultaneously, or in a reverse order to that in which they actually occur. What is known of the habits of this bird, and the way in which it is captured by the natives, has already been described at page 362. The red bird of paradise offers a remarkable case of restricted range, being entirely confined to the small island of Waigiou off the northwest extremity of New Guinea, where it replaces the allied species found in the other islands. The three birds just described form a well-marked group, agreeing in every point of general structure, in their comparatively large size, the brown colour of their bodies, wings, and tail, and in the peculiar character of the ornamental plumage which distinguishes the male bird. The group ranges nearly over the whole area inhabited by the family of the Paradisidae, but each of the species has its own limited region, and is never found in the same district with either of its close allies. To these three birds properly belongs the generic title Paradisei, or true paradise bird. The next species is the Paradisea regia of Linnaeus, or dingbird of paradise, which differs so much from the three preceding species as to deserve a distinct generic name, and it has accordingly been called Cicinnurus regius. By the Malays it is called Burang Raja, or kingbird, and by the natives of the Aru Islands, gobi gobi. This lovely little bird is about 6.5 inches long, partly owing to the very short tail, which does not surpass the somewhat square wings. The head, throat, and entire upper surface are of the richest glossy crimson shade, shading to orange crimson on the forehead, where the feathers extend beyond the nostrils more than halfway down the beak. The plumage is excessively brilliant, shining in certain lights with a metallic or glassy lustre, The breast and belly are pure silky white, between which colour and the red of the throat there is a broad band of rich metallic green, and there is a small spot of the same colour close above each eye. From each side of the body beneath the wing springs a tuft of broad delicate feathers about 1.5 inches long, of an ashy colour, but tipped with a broad band of emerald green, bordered within by a narrow line of buff. These plumes are concealed under the wing, but when the bird pleases, can be raised and spread out so as to form an elegant semicircular fan on each shoulder. But another ornament, still more extraordinary, and if possible more beautiful, adorns this little bird. The 2 middle tail feathers are modified into very slender wire-like shafts, nearly 6 inches long, each of which bears at the extremity, on the inner side only, a web of an emerald green colour, which is coiled up into a perfect spiral disc, and produces a most singular and charming effect. The bill is orange-yellow, and the feet and legs of a fine cobalt blue. See upper figure on the plate of the commencement of this chapter. The female of this little gem is such a plainly coloured bird that it can at first sight be hardly believed to belong to the same species. The upper surface is of a dull earthy brown, a slight tinge of orange-red appearing on the margins of the quills. Beneath it is of a paler yellowish-brown, scaled and banded with narrow dusky markings. The young males are exactly like the female, and they no doubt undergo a series of changes as singular as those of the Paradisea rubra, but unfortunately I was unable to obtain illustrative specimens. This exquisite little creature frequents the smaller trees in the thickest parts of the forest, feeding on various fruits, often of a very large size for so small a bird. It is very active, both on its wings and feet, and makes a whirring sound while flying, something like the South American manakins. It often flutters its wings and displays a beautiful fan which adorns its breast, while the star-bearing tail wires diverge in an elegant double curve. It is tolerably plentiful in the Aru Islands, which led to it being brought to Europe at an early period along with the Paradisea poda. It also occurs in the island of Mysol, and in every part of New Guinea which has been visited by naturalists. We now come to the remarkable little bird, called the Magnificent, first figured by Buffon, and named Paradisea speciosa by Baudard, which, with one allied species, has been formed into a separate genus by Prince Bonaparte by the name of Diphyllodes, from the curious double mantle which clothes the back. The head is covered with short brown velvety feathers, which advance on the back so as to cover the nostrils. From the nape springs a dense mass of feathers with a straw-yellow colour, and about 1.5 inches long, forming a mantle over the upper part of the back. Beneath this, and forming a band about 1/3 of an inch beyond it, a second mantle of rich, glossy, reddish-brown feathers. The rest of the back is orange-brown, and the tail coverts and tail dark bronzy, the wings light orange-buff. The whole undersurface is covered with an abundance of plumage, springing from the margins of the breast, and of a rich deep green colour, with changeable hues of purple. Down the middle of the breast is a broad band of scaly plumes of the same colour, while the chin and throat are of a rich metallic bronze. From the middle of the tail spring 2 narrow feathers of a rich steel blue, and about 10 inches long. These are webbed on the inner side only, and curve outwards so as to form a double circle. From what we know of the habits of allied species, we may be sure that the greatly developed plumage of this bird is erected and displayed in some remarkable manner. The mass of the feathers on the under surface are probably expanded into a hemisphere, while the beautiful yellow mantle is no doubt elevated, so as to give the bird a very different appearance from that which is present in the dried and flattened skins of the natives, through which alone it is at present known. The feet appear to be dark blue. This rare and elegant little bird is found only on the mainland of New Guinea, and in the island of Mysol. A still more rare and beautiful species than the last is the Diphyllodes wilsoni, described by Mr. Cassin from a native skin in the Rich Museum of Philadelphia. The same bird was afterwards named Diphyllodes republica by Prince Bonaparte, and still later Schlegelia calva by Dr. Bernstein, who was so fortunate as to obtain fresh specimens in Waigiou. In this species the upper mantle is sulphur yellow, the lower one and the wings pure red, the breast plumes dark green, and the lengthened middle tail feathers much shorter than in the allied species. The most curious difference is, however, that the top part of the head is bald, the bare skin being of a rich cobalt blue, crossed by several lines of black velvety feathers. It is about the same size as Diphyllodes speciosa, and is no doubt entirely confined to the island of Waigiou. The female, as figured and described by Dr. Bernstein, is very like that of Cicinnurus regius, being similarly banded beneath, and we may therefore conclude that its near ally, the magnificent, is equally plain in this sex, of which the specimens have not yet been obtained. The superb bird of paradise was first figured by Buffon, and was named by Bodard Paradisea atra, from the black ground colour of its plumage. It forms the genus Lopophorina of Waigiou, and is one of the rarest and most brilliant of the group, being only known from mutilated native skins. This bird is a little larger than the magnificent. The ground colour of the plumage is intense black, but with beautiful bronze reflections on the neck, and the whole head scaled with feathers of brilliant metallic green and blue. Over its breast it bears a shield formed of narrow and rather stiff feathers, much elongated towards the sides, of a pure bluish-green colour, and with a satiny gloss. But a still more extraordinary ornament is that which springs from the back of the neck, a shield of a similar form to that on the breast, but much larger and of a velvety black colour, glossed with bronze and purple. The outermost feathers of the shield are half an inch longer than the wing, and when it is elevated it must, in conjunction with the breast shield, completely change the form and whole appearance of the bird. The bill is black, and the feet appear to be yellow. This wonderful little bird inhabits the interior of the northern peninsula of New Guinea only. Neither I nor Mr. Allen could hear anything of it in any of the islands, or on any part of the coast. It is true that it was obtained from the coast natives by lesson, but when at Sarong in 1861, Mr. Allen learnt that it is only found 3 days' journey in the interior. Owing to these black birds of paradise, as they are called, not being so much valued as articles of merchandise, they now seem to be rarely preserved by the natives, and it thus happened that during several years spent on the coasts of New Guinea and the Moluccas, I was never able to obtain a skin. We are, therefore, quite ignorant of the habits of this bird, and also of its female, though the latter is no doubt as plain and inconspicuous as in all the other species of this family. The golden or six-shafted paradise bird is another rare species, first figured by Buffon and never yet obtained in perfect condition. It was named by Bodart Paradisea sexpennis, and forms the genus Parotia of Waigiou. This wonderful bird is about the size of the female Paradisea rubra. The plumage appear at first sight black, but it glows in a certain light with bronze and deep purple. The throat and breast are scaled with broad flat feathers of an intense golden hue, changing to green and blue tints in certain lights. On the back of the head is a broad, recurved band of feathers, whose brilliancy is indescribable, resembling the sheen of emerald and topaz rather than any organic substance. Over the forehead is a large patch of pure white feathers, which shine like satin, and from the side of the head spring the 6 wonderful feathers from which the bird receives its name. These are slender wires, 6 inches long, with a small oval web at the extremity. In addition to these ornaments, there is also an immense tuft of soft feathers on each side of the breast, which, when elevated, must entirely hide the wings, and give the bird an appearance of being double its real bulk. The bill is black, short, and rather compressed, with the feathers advancing over the nostrils, as in the Cichonurus regius. This singular and brilliant bird inhabits the same region as the superb bird of paradise, and nothing whatever is known about it but what we can derive from an examination of the skins preserved by the natives of New Guinea. The standard wing, named Semioptera wallacei by Mr. G. R. Gray, is an entirely new form of bird of paradise, discovered by myself in the island Papuan, and especially distinguished by a pair of long narrow feathers of a white colour, which spring from among the short plumes which clothe the bend of the wing, and are capable of being erected at pleasure. The general colour of this bird is a delicate olive brown, deepening to a loud bronzy olive in the middle of the back, and changing to a delicate ashy violet and a metallic gloss on the crown of the head. The feathers, which cover the nostrils and extend halfway down the beak, are loose and curved upwards. Beneath it is much more beautiful. The scale-like feathers of the breast are margined with rich metallic blue-green, which colour entirely covers the throat and sides of the neck, as well as long pointed plumes, which spring from the sides of the breast and extend nearly as far as the end of the wings. The most curious feature of the bird, however, and one altogether unique in the whole class, is found in the pair of long, narrow, delicate feathers which spring from the wing close to the bend. On lifting the wing coverts, they are seen to arise from 2 tubular horny sheaths, which diverge from near the point of junction of the carpal bones. As already described at page 41, they are erectile, and when the bird is excited are spread out at right angles to the wing and slightly divergent. They are from 6 and 6½ inches long, the upper one slightly exceeding the lower. The total length of the bird is 11 inches. The bill is horny olive, the iris deep olive, and the feet bright orange. The female bird is remarkably plain, being entirely of a dull, pale, earthy brown, with only a slight tinge of ashy violet on the head to relieve its general monotony, and the young males exactly resemble her. See figures at page 41. This bird frequents the lower trees of the forest, and like most paradise birds is in constant motion, flying from branch to branch, clinging to the twigs and even to the smooth and vertical trunks almost as easily as a woodpecker. It continually utters a harsh creaking note, somewhat intermediate between that of the Paradisea apoda and the more musical cry of Cincinnatus regius. The males at short intervals open and flutter the wings, erect the long shoulder feathers, and spread out the elegant green breast shields. The standard wing is found in Gilolo as well as in Batchian, and all the specimens from the former island have the green breast shield rather longer, the crown of the head darker violet, and lower parts of the body rather more strongly scaled with green. This is the only paradise bird yet found in the Moluccan district, all the others being confined in the Papuan Islands and North Australia. We now come to the Epimachidae, or long-billed birds of paradise, which, as before stated, ought not to be separated from the Paradisidae by the intervention of any other birds. One of the most remarkable of these is a 12-wired paradise bird, Paradises alba of Blumenbach, but now placed in the genus Seleucides of Lesson. This bird is about 12 inches long, of which the compressed and curved beak occupies 2 inches. The colour of the breast and upper surface appears at first sight nearly black, but a close examination shows that no part of it is devoid of colour, and by holding it in various lights, the most rich and glowing tints become visible. The head, covered with short velvety feathers, which advance on the chin much further than on the upper part of the beak, is of a purplish bronze colour. The whole of the back and shoulders is rich bronzy green, while the closed wings and tail are of the most brilliant violet purple, all the plumage having a delicate silky gloss. The mass of feathers which cover the breast is really almost black, with faint glosses of green and purple, but their outer edges are margined with glittering bands of emerald green. The lower part of the body is rich buffy yellow, including the tuft of plumes which spring from the sides and extend 1.5 inches beyond the tail. When skins are exposed to the light, the yellow fades into dull white, from which circumstance it derived its specific name. About 6 of the innermost plumes on each side have the midrib elongated into slender black wires, which bend at right angle and curve somewhat backwards to a length of about 10 inches, forming one of the most extraordinary and fantastic ornaments with which this group of birds abounds. The bill is jet black and the feet bright yellow. See lower figure on the plate at the beginning of this chapter. The female, although not quite so plain a bird as in the other species, presents none of the gay colours or ornamental plumage of the male. The top of the head and the back of the neck are black, the rest of the upper parts rich reddish brown, while the undersurface is entirely yellowish ashy, somewhat blackish on the breast, and crossed throughout with narrow blackish wavy bands. The Seleucides alba is found on the island of Salwati and in the northwestern parts of New Guinea, where it frequents flowering trees, especially sago palms and pandani, sucking the flowers, round and beneath which its unusually large and powerful feet enabled it to cling. Its motions are very rapid. It seldom rests more than a few moments on one tree, after which it flies straight off, and with great swiftness, to another. It has a loud shrill cry, to be heard a long way, consisting of ka, ka, repeated 5 or 6 times in a descending scale, and at the last note it generally flies away. The males are quite solitary in their habits, although perhaps they assemble at certain times like the true paradise birds. All the specimens shot and opened by my assistant Mr. Allen, who obtained this fine bird during his last voyage to New Guinea, had nothing in their stomachs but a brown sweet liquid, probably the nectar of the flowers on which they had been feeding. They certainly, however, eat both fruit and insects, for a specimen which I saw alive on board a Dutch steamer ate cockroaches and papaya fruit voraciously. This bird had the curious habit of resting at noon, with the bill pointing vertically upwards. It died on the passage to Batavia, and I secured the body and formed a skeleton, which shows indisputably that it is really a bird of paradise. The tongue is very long and extensible, but flat and little fibrous at the end, exactly like the true Paradises. In the island of Salwati, the natives search in the forest till they find the sleeping place of the bird, which they know by seeing its dung upon the ground. It is generally in a low bushy tree. At night they climb up the trap and either shoot the birds with blunt arrows, or even catch them alive with a cloth. In New Guinea they are caught by placing snares on the trees frequented by them, in the same way as the red paradise birds are caught in Waigiou, and which has already been described at page 362. The great epimac, or long-tailed paradise bird, Epimachus magnus, is another of these wonderful creatures, only known by the imperfect skins prepared by the natives. In its dark velvety plumage, glowed with bronze and purple, it resembles the Seleucides alba, but it bears a magnificent tail more than 2 feet long, glossed on the upper surface with the most intense opalescent blue. Its chief ornament, however, consists in the group of broad plumes which spring from the side of the breast, and which are dilated at the extremity, and banded with the most vivid metallic blue and green. The bill is long and curved, and the feet black and similar to those of the allied forms. The total length of this fine bird is between 3 and 4 feet. This splendid bird inhabits the mountains of New Guinea, in the same district with the superb and six-shafted paradise birds, and, as I was informed, is sometimes found in the ranges near the coast. I was several times assured by different natives that this bird makes its nest in a hole underground, or under rocks, or choosing a place with 2 apertures, so that it may enter at one end and go out the other. This is very unlike what we should suppose to be the habits of the bird, but it is not easy to conceive how the story originated if not true, and all travellers know that native accounts of the habits of the animals, however strange they may seem, almost invariably turn out to be correct. The scale-breasted paradise bird, Epimachus magnificus of Cuvier, is now generally placed with the Australian rifle birds in the genus Ptiloris. Though very beautiful, these birds are less strikingly decorated with accessory plumage than the other species we've been describing, their chief ornament being a more or less developed breastplate of stiff metallic green feathers, and a small tuft of somewhat hairy plumes on the side of the breast. The back and wings of the species are of an intense velvety black, faintly glossed in certain lights with rich purple. The 2 broad middle tail feathers are opalescent green-blue, with a velvety surface, and the top of the head is covered with feathers resembling scales of burnished steel. A large triangular space covering the chin, throat, and breast is densely scaled with feathers, having a steel blue or green lustre and silky feel. This is edged below with a narrow band of black, followed by shiny bronzy green, below which the body is covered with hairy feathers of a rich claret colour, deepening to a black at the tail. The tufts of side plumes somewhat resemble those of the true birds of paradise, but are scanty, about as long as the tail, and of a black colour. The sides of the head are rich violet, and velvety feathers extend to each side of the beak over the nostrils. I obtained at Dorey a young male of this bird in a state of plumage which is no doubt that of the adult female, as in the case in all allied species. The upper surface, wings and tail are rich reddish-brown, while the under surface is of a pale ashy colour, closely barred throughout with narrow wavy black bands. There is also a pale banded stripe over the eye, and a long dusky stripe from the gape down each side of the neck. This bird is 14 inches long, whereas the native skins of the adult male are only about 10 inches, owing to the way in which the tail is pushed in, so as to give as much prominence as possible to the ornamental plumage of the breast. At Cape York in North Australia there is a closely allied species, Ptiloris alberti, the female of which is very similar to the young male bird here described. The beautiful rifle birds of Australia, which much resemble those paradise birds, are named Ptiloris paradiseus and Ptiloris victoris. The scale-breasted paradise bird seems to be confined to the mainland of New Guinea, and is less rare than several of the other species. There are 3 other New Guinea birds, which are by some authors classed with the birds of paradise, and which, being almost equally remarkable for splendid plumage, deserve to be noticed here. The first is the Paradisepia astrapia nigra of Lesson, a bird of the size of Paradises rubra, but with a very long tail, glossed above with intense violet. The back is bronzy black, the lower parts green, the throat and neck bordered with loose broad feathers of an intense coppery hue, while on the top of the head and neck they are glittering emerald green. All the plumage round the head is lengthened and erectile, and when spread out by the living bird must have an effect hardly surpassed by any of the true paradise birds. The bill is black, and the feet yellow. The Astrapia seems to me to be somewhat intermediate between the Paradisidae and Epimachidae. There is an allied species having a bare carunculated head, which has been called Paradigala carunculata. It is believed to inhabit, with the preceding, the mountainous interior of the New Guinea, but is exceedingly rare, the only known specimen being in the Philadelphia Museum. The paradise oriole is another beautiful bird, which is now sometimes classed with the birds of paradise. It has been named Paradises aurea and Oriolus aureus by the old naturalists, and is now generally placed in the same genus as the regent bird of Australia, Sericulus chrysocephalus. But the form of the bill and the character of the plumage seem to me to be so different that it will have to form a distinct genus. This bird is almost entirely yellow, with the exception of the throat, the tail, and part of the wings and back, which are black. But it is chiefly characterized by the quantity of long feathers of an intense glossy orange colour, which cover its neck down to the middle of the back, almost like the hackles of a gamecock. This beautiful bird inhabits the mainland of New Guinea, and is also found in Salwatty, but is so rare that I was only able to obtain one imperfect native skin, and nothing whatever is known of its habits. I will now give a list of all the birds of paradise yet known, with the places they are believed to inhabit. Paradise apoda, the great paradise bird, Aru Islands. Paradise papuana, the lesser paradise bird, New Guinea, Mysol, Jobe. Paradise rubra, the red paradise bird, Waigiou. Cicinnurus regius, the king paradise bird, New Guinea, Aru Islands, Mysol, Salwatty. Diphyllodes speciosa, the magnificent, New Guinea, Mysol, Salwatty. Diphyllodes wilsoni, the red magnificent, Waigiou. Lophorina atra, the superb, New Guinea. Parotia sexpennis, the golden paradise bird, New Guinea. Semioptera wallacei, the standard wing, Batchian, Gilolo. Epimachus magnus, the long-tailed paradise bird, New Guinea. Seleucides alba, the 12-wired paradise bird, New Guinea, Salwatty. Ptiloris magnifica, the scale-breasted paradise bird, New Guinea. Ptiloris alberti, Prince Albert's paradise bird, North Australia. Ptiloris paradisei, the rifle bird, East Australia. Ptiloris victoria, the Victorian rifle bird, Northeast Australia. Astrapia nigra, the paradise pie, New Guinea. Paradigala carunculata, the carunculated paradise pie, New Guinea. Sericulus aureus, the paradise oriole, New Guinea, Salwatty. We see therefore that of the 18 species which seem to deserve a place among the birds of paradise, 11 are known to inhabit the great island of New Guinea, 8 of which are entirely confined to it, and the hardly separated island of Salwatty. But if we consider those islands which are now united to New Guinea by a shallow sea to really form a part of it, we shall find that 14 of the paradise birds belong to the country, while 3 inhabit the northern eastern parts of Australia, and 1 of the Moluccas. All the more extraordinary and magnificent species are, however, entirely confined to the Papuan region. Although I devoted so much time to a search after these wonderful birds, I only succeeded myself in obtaining 5 species during a residence of many months in the Aru Islands, New Guinea, and Waigiou. Mr. Allen's voyage to Mysol did not procure a single additional species, but we both heard of a place called Sorong on the mainland of New Guinea, near Salwatty, where we were told that all the kinds we desired could be obtained. We therefore determined that he should visit this place, and endeavour to penetrate into the interior among the natives who actually shoot and skin the birds of paradise. He went in the small prau I had fitted up at Goram, and through the kind assistance of the Dutch resident at Ternate, a lieutenant and 2 soldiers were sent by the Sultan of Tidore to accompany and protect him, and to assist him in getting men and in visiting the interior. Notwithstanding these precautions, Mr. Allen met with difficulties in this voyage, which we had neither of us encountered before. To understand these, it is necessary to consider that the birds of paradise are an article of commerce, and are the monopoly of the chiefs of the coast villages, who obtain them at a low rate from the mountaineers, and sell them to the Bugis traders. A portion is also paid every year as tribute to the Sultan of Tidore. The natives are therefore very jealous of a stranger, especially a European, interfering in their trade, and above all of going to the interior to deal with the mountaineers themselves. They of course think that he will raise the prices in the interior, and lessen the supply on the coast, greatly to their disadvantage. They also think that their tribute will be raised if a European takes back a quantity of the rare sorts, and they have besides a vague and very natural dread of some ulterior object in a white man's coming at so much trouble and expense to their country only to get birds of paradise, of which they know he can buy plenty of the common yellow ones, which they alone value, at Ternate, Macassar, or Singapore. It thus happened that when Mr. Allen arrived at Sorong, and explained his intentions of going to seek birds of paradise in the interior, innumerable objections were raised. He was told it was 3 or 4 days' journey over swamps and mountains, that the mountaineers were savages and cannibals who would certainly kill him, and lastly that not a man in the village could be found who dare go with him. After some days spent in these discussions, as he still persisted in making the attempt, and showed them his authority from the Sultan of Tidore to go where he pleased and receive every assistance, they at length provided him with a boat to go the first part of the journey up a river. At the same time, however, they sent private orders to the interior villages to refuse to sell any provisions, so as to compel him to return. On arriving at the village where they were to leave the river and strike inland, the coast people returned, leaving Mr. Allen to get on as he could. Here he called on the Tidore lieutenant to assist him, and procure men as guides, and carry his baggage to the villages of the mountaineers. This, however, was not so easily done. A quarrel took place, and the natives, refusing to obey the imperious orders of the lieutenant, got out their knives and spears to attack him and his soldiers, and Mr. Allen himself was obliged to interfere to protect those who had come to guard him. The respect due to a white man and the timely distribution of a few presents prevailed, and on showing the knives, hatchets, and beads he was willing to give to those who accompanied him, peace was restored, and the next day, travelling over a frightfully rugged country, they reached the villages of the mountaineers. Here Mr. Allen remained a month without any interpreter through which he could understand a word or communicate a want. However, by signs and presents, and a pretty liberal barter, he got on very well, some of them accompanying him every day in the forest to shoot, and receiving a small present when he was successful. In the grand matter of the paradise birds, however, little was done. Only one additional species was found, the Seleucida alba, of which he had already obtained a specimen in Salwati, but he learnt that the other kinds, of which he showed them drawings, were found in 2 or 3 days' journey further in the interior. When I sent my men from Dori to Amberbaki, they heard exactly the same story, that the rarer sorts were only found several days' journey in the interior, among rugged mountains, and that the skins were prepared by savage tribes who had never been seen by any of the coast people. It seems as if nature had taken precautions that these her choicest treasures should not be made too common, and thus be undervalued. This northern coast of New Guinea is exposed to the full swell of the Pacific Ocean, and is rugged and harbourless. The country is all rocky and mountainous, covered everywhere with dense forests, offering in its swamps and precipices and serrated ridges an almost impassable barrier to the unknown interior. And the people are dangerous savages, in the very lowest stage of barbarism. In such a country and among such a people are found these wonderful productions of nature, the birds of paradise, whose exquisite beauty of form and colour and strange development of plumage are calculated to excite the wonder and admiration of the most civilized and most intellectual of mankind, and to furnish inexhaustible materials for study to the naturalist, and for speculation by the philosopher. Thus ended my search after these beautiful birds. 5 voyages to different parts of the district they inhabit, each occupying in its preparation and execution the larger part of a year, produced me only 5 species out of the 14 known to exist in the New Guinea district. The kinds obtained are those that inhabit the coast of New Guinea and its islands, the remainder seeming to be strictly confined to the central mountain ranges of the northern peninsula. And our researches at Dori and Amberbaki, near one end of this island, and at Salwati and Sarong, near the other, enable me to decide with some certainty on the native country of these rare and lovely birds, good specimens of which have never been yet seen in Europe. It must be considered as somewhat extraordinary that, during 5 years' residence and travel in Celebes, Moluccas, and New Guinea, I should never have been able to purchase skins of half the species which Lesson, 40 years ago, obtained during a few weeks in the same countries. I believe that all, except the common species of commerce, are now much more difficult to obtain than they were even 20 years ago, and I impute it principally to their having been sought after by the Dutch officials through the Sultan of Tidore. The chiefs of the annual expeditions to collect tribute have had orders to get all the rare sorts of paradise birds, and as they pay little or nothing for them, it being sufficient to say that they are for the Sultan, the headmen of the coast villages would for the future refuse to purchase them from the mountaineers, and confine themselves instead to the commoner species, which are less sought after by amateurs, but are a more profitable merchandise. The same causes frequently lead the inhabitants of uncivilized countries to conceal minerals or other natural products with which they become acquainted, from the fear of being obliged to pay increased tribute, or of bringing upon themselves a new and oppressive labour. End of Chapter 38. Recording by Nicholas Longhurst. Chapter 39 of the Malay Archipelago, Volume 2, by Alfred Russel WALLACE. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Nicholas Longhurst. Chapter 39. The Natural History of the Papuan Islands. New Guinea, with the islands joined to it by a shallow sea, constitute the Papuan group, characterized by a very close resemblance in their peculiar forms of life. Having already in my chapters on the Aru Islands and on the Birds of Paradise given some details of the natural history of this district, I shall here confine myself to a general sketch of its animal productions and of their relations to those of the rest of the world. New Guinea is perhaps the largest island on the globe, being a little larger than Borneo. It is nearly 1,400 miles long, and in the widest part 400 broad, and seems to be everywhere covered with luxuriant forests. Almost everything that is yet known of its natural productions comes from the northwestern peninsula, and a few islands grouped around it. These do not constitute a tenth part of the area of the whole island, and are so cut off from it that their fauna may well be somewhat different, yet they've produced us, with a very partial exploration, no less than 250 species of land birds, almost all unknown elsewhere, and comprising some of the most curious and most beautiful of the feathered tribes. It is needless to say how much interest attaches to the far larger unknown portion of this great island, the greatest terra incognita that still remains for the naturalist to explore, and the only region where altogether new and unimagined forms of life may perhaps be found. There is now, I am happy to say, some chance that this great country will no longer remain absolutely unknown to us. The Dutch government have granted well-equipped steamer to carry a naturalist, Mr. Rosenberg already mentioned in this work, and assistants to New Guinea, where they are to spend some years in circumnavigating the island, ascending its large rivers as far as possible into the interior, and making extensive collections of its natural productions. The mammalia of New Guinea and the adjacent islands yet discovered are only 17 in number. 2 of these are bats, one is a pig of peculiar species, Sus papuensis, and the rest are all marsupials. The bats are, no doubt, much more numerous, but there is every reason to believe that whatever new land mammalia may be discovered will belong to the marsupial order. One of these is a true kangaroo, very similar to the middle-sized kangaroos of Australia, and it is remarkable as being the first animal of its kind ever seen by Europeans. It inhabits Mysol and the Aru Islands, an allied species being found in New Guinea, and was seen and described by Lebrun in 1714 from living specimens at Batavia. A much more extraordinary creature is the tree kangaroo, 2 species of which are known from New Guinea. These animals do not differ very strikingly in form from the terrestrial kangaroos, and appear to be but imperfectly adapted to an arboreal life, as they move rather slowly, and do not seem to have a very secure footing on the limb of a tree. The leaping power of the muscular tail is lost, and powerful claws have been acquired to assist in climbing, but in other respects the animal seems better adapted to walls on terra firma. This imperfect adaptation may be due to the fact of there being no carnivore in New Guinea, and no enemies of any kind from which these animals have to escape by rapid climbing. 4 species of couscous and the small flying opossum also inhabit New Guinea, and there are 5 other smaller marsupials, one of which is the size of a rat, and takes its place by entering houses and devouring provisions. The birds of New Guinea offer the greatest possible contrast to the mammalia, since they are more numerous, more beautiful, and afford more new, curious, and elegant forms than those of any other island on the globe. Besides the birds of paradise, which we've already sufficiently considered, it possesses a number of other curious birds, which in the eyes of the ornithologist almost serves to distinguish it as one of the primary divisions of the earth. Among its 30 species of parrots are the great pluck cockatoo and the little rigid-tailed nasiterna, the giant and the dwarf of the whole tribe. The bare-headed Dactylus is one of the most singular parrots known, while the beautiful little long-tailed Charmosyna and the great variety of gorgeously coloured lories have no parallel elsewhere. Of pigeons it possesses about 40 distinct species, among which are the magnificent crowned pigeons, now so well known in our aviaries, and preeminent both for size and beauty. The curious Trugon terrestris, which approaches the still more strange Didunculus of Samoa, and a new genus, Henicophaps, discovered by myself, which possesses a very long and powerful bill, quite unlike that of any other pigeon. Among its 16 kingfishers, it possesses the curious hook-billed Macorina and a red and blue Tanysiptera, the most beautiful of that beautiful genus. Among its perching birds are the fine genus of crow-like starlings, with brilliant plumage, Manucodia, the carious pale-coloured crow, Gymnocorvus senex, the abnormal red and black flycatcher, Peltops blainvilli, the curious little boat-billed flycatchers, Machirenchus, and the elegant blue flycatcher wrens, Todopsis. The naturalist will obtain a clearer idea of the variety and interest of the productions of this country by the statement that its land birds belong to 108 genera, of which 20 are exclusively characteristic of it, while 35 belong to that limited area which includes the Moluccas and North Australia, and whose species of these genera have been entirely derived from New Guinea. About 1/2 of the New Guinea genera are found also in Australia, about 1/3 in India and the Indo-Malay Islands. A very curious fact, not hitherto sufficiently noticed, is the appearance of a pure Malay element in the birds of New Guinea. We find 2 species of Eupetes, a curious Malayan genus allied to the fork-tailed water-chats, 2 of Alchippe, an Indian and Malay wren-like form, an Arachnothera, quite resembling the spider-catching honeysuckers of Malacca, 2 species of Gracula, the mynas of India, and a curious little Prionoculus, a sole-billed fruit-pecker undoubtedly allied to the Malayan form, though perhaps a distinct genus. Now not one of these birds, or anything allied to them, occurs in the Moluccas, or, with one exception, in Celebes or Australia, and as they are most of them birds of short flight, it is very difficult to conceive how or when they could have crossed the space of more than 1,000 miles, which now separates them from their nearest allies. Such facts point to the change of land and sea on a large scale, and at a rate which, measured by the time required for a change of species, must be termed rapid. By speculating on such changes, we may easily see how partial waves of immigration may have entered New Guinea, and how all trace of their passage may have been obliterated by the subsequent disappearance of the intervening land. There is nothing that the study of geology teaches us that is more certain or more impressive than the extreme instability of the earth's surface. Everywhere beneath our feet we find proofs that what is land has been sea, and that where oceans now spread out has once been land, and that this change from sea to land and from land to sea has taken place not once or twice only, but again and again during countless ages of past time. Now the study of the distribution of animal life upon the present surface of the earth causes us to look upon this constant interchange of land and sea, this making and unmaking of continents, this elevation and disappearance of islands, as a potent reality, which has always and everywhere been in progress, and has been the main agent in determining the manner in which living things are now grouped and scattered over the earth's surface. And when we continually come upon such little anomalies of distribution as that now just described, we find the only rational explanation of them in those repeated elevations and depressions which have left their record in mysterious but still intelligible characters in the face of organic nature. The insects of New Guinea are less known than the birds, but they seem almost equally remarkable for fine forms and brilliant colours. The magnificent green and yellow Ornithoptera are abundant, and have most probably spread westward from this point as far as India. Among the smaller butterflies are several peculiar genera of Nymphalidae and Lycaenidae, remarkable for their large size, singular markings, or brilliant coloration. The largest and most beautiful of the clear-winged moths, Cocytiae devilli, is found here, as well as a large and handsome green moth, Nyctalemon orontes. The beetles furnish us with many species of large size and of the most brilliant metallic lustre, among which is the Temesternus mirabilis, a longicorn beetle of a golden-green colour, the excessively brilliant rose chafers, Lomaptera wallacei, and Anacamptorhina fulgida, one of the handsomest of the Buprestidae, Calodoma wallacei, and several fine blue weevils of the genus Eupholus, are perhaps the most conspicuous. Almost all the other orders furnish us with large or extraordinary forms. The curious horned flies have already been mentioned, and among the Orthoptera the great shielded grasshoppers are the most remarkable. The species here figured, Megalodon ensifer, has the thorax covered by a large triangular horny shield, 2½ inches long, with serrated edges, a somewhat wavy hollow surface, and fawn median line, so as very closely to resemble a leaf. The glossy wing coverts, when fully expanded, more than 9 inches across, are of a fine green colour, and so beautifully veined as to imitate closely some of the largest shining tropical leaves. The body is short and terminated in the female by a long curved sword-like ovipositor, not seen in the cut, and the legs are all long and strongly spined. These insects are sluggish in their motions, depending for safety on the resemblance of foliage, their horny shield and wing coverts, and their spiny legs. The large islands to the east of New Guinea are very little known, but the occurrence of crimson lories, which are quite absent from Australia, and of cockatoos allied to those of New Guinea and the Moluccas, shows that they belong to the Papuan group, and we are thus able to define the Malay Archipelago as extended eastwards to the Solomon Islands. New Caledonia and the New Hebrides, on the other hand, seem more nearly allied to Australia, and the rest of the islands of the Pacific, though very poor in all forms of life, possess a few peculiarities which compel us to class them as a separate group. Although as a matter of convenience I have always separated the Moluccas as a distinct zoological group from New Guinea, I have at the same time pointed out that its fauna was chiefly derived from the island, just as that of Timor was chiefly derived from Australia. If we were dividing the Australian region for zoological purposes alone, we should form three great groups, one comprising Australia, Timor, and Tasmania, another New Guinea with the islands from Bouru to the Solomons group, and the third comprising the greater part of the Pacific Islands. The relation of the New Guinea fauna to that of Australia is very close. It is best marked in the mammalia by the abundance of marsupials, and the almost complete absence of other terrestrial forms. In birds it is less striking, although still very clear, for all the remarkable Old World forms which are absent from the one are equally so from the other, such as pheasants, grouse, vultures, and woodpeckers, while cockatoos, broad-tailed parrots, podargi, and the great families of the honeysuckers and brush turkeys, with many others, comprising no less than 24 genera of land birds, are common to both countries, and are entirely confined to them. When we consider the wonderful dissimilarity of the two regions, in all those physical conditions which were once supposed to determine the forms of life, Australia with its open plains, stony deserts, dried up rivers, and changeable temperate climate, New Guinea with its luxuriant forests, uniformly hot, moist, and evergreen, this great similarity in their productions is almost astounding, and unmistakably points to a common origin. The resemblance is not nearly so strongly marked in insects, the reason obviously being that this class of animals are much more immediately dependent on vegetation and climate than are the more highly organized birds and mammalia. Insects also have far more effective means of distribution, and have spread widely in every district favourable to their development and increase. The giant Ornithoptera have thus spread from New Guinea over the whole archipelago, and as far as the base of the Himalayas, while the elegant long-horned Anthribidae have spread in the opposite direction, from Malacca to New Guinea, but owing to unfavourable conditions, have not been able to establish themselves in Australia. That country, on the other hand, has developed a variety of flower-haunting chafers and Buprestidae, and numbers of large and curious terrestrial weevils, scarcely any of which are adapted to the damp, gloomy forests of New Guinea, where entirely different forms are to be found. There are, however, some groups of insects constituting what appear to be the remains of the ancient population of the equatorial parts of Australian region, which is still almost entirely confined to it. Such are the interesting subfamily of the Longicorn Coleoptera, Mystidonatae, one of the best marked genera of Buprestidae, Cevogastra, and the beautiful weevils forming the genus Eupholus. Among butterflies we have the genera Mynes, Hippocista, and Elodina, and the curious eye-spotted Drusilla, of which last a single species is found in Java, but in no other of the western islands. The facilities for the distribution of plants are still greater than they are for insects, and it is the opinion of eminent botanists that no such clearly defined regions can be marked out in botany as in zoology. The causes which tend to fusion are here most powerful, and have led to such intermingling of the floras of adjacent regions that none but broad and general divisions can now be detected. These remarks have an important bearing on the problem of dividing the surface of the earth into great regions, distinguished by a radical difference of their natural productions. Such differences we now know to be the direct result of long-continued separation by more or less impassable barriers, and as wide oceans and great contrast of temperature are the most complete barriers to the dispersal of all terrestrial forms of life, the primary divisions of the earth should in the main serve for all terrestrial organisms. However various may be the effects of climate, However unequal the means of distribution, these will never altogether obliterate the radical effects of long-continued isolation. And it is my firm conviction that when the botany and the entomology of New Guinea and the surrounding islands become as well known as their mammals and birds, these departments of nature will also plainly indicate the radical distinctions of the Indo-Malayan and Austro-Malayan regions of the Great Malay Archipelago. End of Chapter 39. Recording by Nicholas Longhurst.
Chapter 40 of the Malay Archipelago, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by deongines, Salt Lake City, Utah. The Malay Archipelago, Volume 2, by Alfred Russel WALLACE. Chapter 40, Part 1. The Races of Man in the Malay Archipelago. Propose to conclude this account of my Eastern travels with a short statement of my views as to the races of man which inhabit the various parts of the archipelago, their chief physical and mental characteristics, their affinities with each other and with surrounding tribes, their migrations, and their probable origin. Two very strongly contrasted races inhabit the archipelago: the Malays, occupying almost exclusively the larger western half of it, and the Papuans, whose headquarters are New Guinea and several of the adjacent islands. Between these in locality are found tribes who are also intermediate in their chief characteristics, and it is sometimes a nice point to determine whether they belong to one or the other race, or have been formed from a mixture of the two. The Malay is undoubtedly the most important of these two races, as it is the one which is the most civilized, which has come most into contact with Europeans, and which alone has any place in history. What may be called the true Malay races, as distinguished from others who have merely a Malay element in their language, present a considerable uniformity of physical and mental characteristics, while there are very great differences of civilization and of language. They consist of 4 great and a few minor semi-civilized tribes, and a number of others who may be termed savages. The Malays proper inhabit the Malay Peninsula and almost all the coast regions of Borneo and Sumatra. They all speak the Malay language or dialects of it. They write in the Arabic character and are Mohammedans in religion. The Javanese inhabit Java, part of Sumatra, Madura, Bali, and part of Lombok. They speak the Javanese and Kawi languages, and they write in a native character. They are now Mohammedans in Java, but Brahmins in Bali and Lombok. The Bugis are the inhabitants of the greater part of Celebes, and there seems to be an allied people in Sumbawa. They speak the Bugis and Makaskar languages with dialects, and have 2 different native characters in which they write these. They are all Mohammedans. The 4th great race is that of the Tagalas in the Philippine Islands, about whom, as I did not visit those islands, I shall say little. Many of them are now Christians and speak Spanish as well as their native tongue, the Tagala. The Moluccan Malays, who inhabit chiefly Ternate, Tidore, Batchian, and Amboyna, may be held to form a 5th division of semi-civilized Malays. They are all Mohammedans, but they speak a variety of curious languages, which seem compounded of Bugis and Javanese, with the languages of the savage tribes of the Moluccas. The savage Malays are the Dyaks of Borneo, the Bataks and other wild tribes of Sumatra, the Jakuns of the Malay Peninsula, the Aborigines of northern Celebes, of the Sula Island, and of part of Boru. The color of all these varied tribes is a light reddish-brown, with more or less of an olive tinge, not varying in any important degree over an extent of country as large as all southern Europe. The hair is equally constant, being invariably black and straight, and of a rather coarse texture, so that any lighter tint, or any wave or curl in it, is an almost certain proof of the admixture of some foreign blood. The race is nearly destitute of beard, and the breast and limbs are free from hair. The stature is tolerably equal, and is always considerably below that of the average European. The body is robust, the breast well developed, the feet small, thick, and short, the hands small and rather delicate. The face is a little broad, and inclined to be flat. The forehead is rather rounded, the brows low, the eyes black, and very slightly oblique. The nose is rather small, not prominent, but straight and well shaped, the apex a little rounded, the nostrils broad and slightly exposed. The cheekbones are rather prominent, the mouth large, the lips broad and well cut, but not protruding, the chin round and well formed. In this description there seems little to object to on the score of beauty, and yet on the whole the Malays are certainly not handsome. In youth, however, they are often very good looking, and many of the boys and girls up to 12 or 15 years of age are very pleasing, and some have countenances which are in their way almost perfect. I am inclined to think they lose much of their good looks by bad habits and irregular living. At a very early age they chew betel and tobacco almost incessantly. They suffer much want and exposure in their fishing and other excursions. Their lives are often passed in alternate starvation and feasting, idleness and excessive labor, and this naturally produces premature old age and harshness of features. In character the Malay is impassive. He exhibits a reserve, diffidence, and even bashfulness, which is in some degree attractive, and leads the observer to think that the ferocious and bloodthirsty character imputed to the race must be grossly exaggerated. He is not demonstrative. His feelings of surprise, admiration, or fear are never openly manifested, and are probably not strongly felt. He is slow and deliberate in speech, and circuitous in introducing the subject he has come expressly to discuss. These are the main features of his moral nature, and exhibit themselves in every action of his life. Children and women are timid, and scream and run at the unexpected sight of a European. In the company of men they are silent, and are generally quiet and obedient. When alone, the Malay is taciturn. He neither talks nor sings to himself. When several are paddling in a canoe, they occasionally chant a monotonous and plaintive song. He is cautious of giving offence to his equals. He does not quarrel easily about money matters, dislikes asking too frequently even for payment of his just debts, and will often give them up altogether rather than quarrel with his debtor. Practical joking is utterly repugnant to his disposition, for he is particularly sensitive to breaches of etiquette, or any interference with the personal liberty of himself or another. As an example, I may mention that I have often found it very difficult to get one Malay servant to waken another. He will call as loud as he can, but will hardly touch, much less shake his comrade. I have frequently had to waken a hard sleeper myself when on a land or sea journey. The higher classes of Malays are exceedingly polite, and have all the quiet ease and dignity of the best bred Europeans. Yet this is compatible with a reckless cruelty and contempt of human life, which is the dark side of their character. It is not to be wondered at, therefore, that different persons give totally opposite accounts of them, one praising them for their soberness, civility, and good nature, another abusing them for their deceit, treachery, and cruelty. The old traveller Nicolo Conti, writing in 1430, says, "The inhabitants of Java and Sumatra exceed every other people in cruelty. They regard killing a man as a mere jest, nor is any punishment allotted for such a deed. If any one purchase a new sword and wish to try it, he will thrust it into the breast of the first person he meets. The passers-by examine and praise the skill of the person who inflicted it, if he thrust in the weapon direct. Yet Drake says of the south of Java, the people, as are their kings, are a very loving, true, and just-dealing people. And Mr. Crawford says that the Javanese, whom he knew thoroughly, are a peaceable, docile, sober, simple, and industrious people. Barboza, on the other hand, who saw them at Malacca about 1660, says, "They are a people of great ingenuity, very subtle in all their dealings, very malicious, great deceivers, seldom speaking the truth, prepared to do all manner of wickedness, and ready to sacrifice their lives." The intellect of the Malay race seems rather deficient. They are incapable of anything beyond the simplest combinations of ideas, and have little taste or energy for the acquirement of knowledge. Their civilization, such as it is, does not seem to be indigenous, as it is entirely confined to those nations who have been converted to the Mohammedan or Brahminical religions. I will now give an equally brief sketch of the other great race of the Malay Archipelago, the Papuan. The typical Papuan race is in many respects the very opposite of the Malay, and it has hitherto been very imperfectly described. The colour of the body is a deep, sooty brown or black, sometimes approaching, but never quite equalling, the jet black of some negro races. It varies in tint, however, more than that of the Malay, and is sometimes a dusky brown. The hair is very peculiar, being harsh, dry, and frizzly, growing in little tufts or curls, which in youth are very short and compact, but afterwards grow out to a considerable length, forming the compact, frizzled mop, which is the Papuan's pride and glory. The face is adorned with a beard of the same frizzly nature as the hair of the head. The arms, legs, and breast are also more or less clothed with hair of a similar nature. In stature, the Papuan decidedly surpasses the Malay, and is perhaps equal or even superior to the average of Europeans. The legs are long and thin, and the hands and feet larger than in the Malays. The face is somewhat elongated, the forehead flattish, the brows very prominent. The nose is large, rather arched and high, the base thick, the nostrils broad, and the aperture hidden, owing to the tip of the nose being elongated. The mouth is large, the lips thick and protuberant. The face has thus an altogether more European aspect than the Malay, owing to the large nose and the peculiar form of this organ, with the more prominent brows and the character of the hair on the head, face, and body, enable us at a glance to distinguish the two races. I have observed that most of these characteristic features are as distinctly visible in children of 10 or 12 years old as in adults, and the peculiar form of the nose is always shown in the figures which they carve for ornaments to their houses, or as charms to wear round their necks. The moral characteristics of the Papuan appear to me to separate him as distinctly from the Malay as do his form and features. He is impulsive and demonstrative in speech and action. His emotions and passions express themselves in shouts and laughter, in yells and frantic leapings. Women and children take their share in every discussion, and seem little alarmed at the sight of strangers and Europeans. Of the intellect of this race it is very difficult to judge, but I am inclined to rate it somewhat higher than that of the Malays, notwithstanding the fact that the Papuans have never yet made any advance towards civilization. It must be remembered, however, that for centuries the Malays have been influenced by Hindu, Chinese, and Arabic immigration, whereas the Papuan race has only been subjected to the very partial and local influence of Malay traders. The Papuan has much more vital energy, which would certainly greatly assist his intellectual development. Papuan slaves show no inferiority of intellect compared with Malays, but rather the contrary, and in the Moluccas they are often promoted to places of considerable trust. The Papuan has a greater feeling for art than the Malay. He decorates his canoe, his house, and almost every domestic utensil with elaborate carving, a habit which is rarely found among tribes of the Malay race. In the affections and moral sentiments, on the other hand, the Papuans seem very deficient. In the treatment of their children they are often violent and cruel, whereas the Malays are almost invariably kind and gentle, hardly ever interfering at all with their children's pursuits and amusements, and giving them perfect liberty at whatever age they wish to claim it. But these very peaceful relations between parents and children are, no doubt, in a great measure, due to the listless and apathetic character of the race, which never leads the younger members into serious opposition to the elders, while the harsher discipline of the Papuans may be chiefly due to that greater vigour and energy of mind which always, sooner or later, leads to the rebellion of the weaker against the stronger, the people against their rulers, the slave against his master, or the child against its parent. It appears, therefore, that whether we consider their physical conformation, their moral characteristics, or their intellectual capacities, the Malay and Papuan races offer remarkable differences and striking contrasts. The Malay is of short stature, brown-skinned, straight-haired, beardless, and smooth-bodied. The Papuan is taller, is black-skinned, frizzle-haired, bearded, and hairy-bodied. The former is broad-faced, has a small nose and flat eyebrows. The latter is long-faced, has a large and prominent nose and projecting eyebrows. The Malay is bashful, cold, undemonstrative, and quiet. The Papuan is bold, impetuous, excitable, and noisy. The former is grave and seldom laughs. The latter is joyous and laughter-loving. The one conceals his emotions, the other displays them. Having thus described in some detail the great physical, intellectual, and moral differences between the Malays and Papuans, we have to consider the inhabitants of the numerous islands which do not agree very closely with either of these races. The islands of Obi, Batchian, and the 3 southern peninsulas of Gilolo possess no true indigenous population, but the northern peninsula is inhabited by a native race, the so-called Alfuros of Saho and Galela. These people are quite distinct from the Malays and almost equally so from the Papuans. They are tall and well made, with Papuan features and curly hair. They are bearded and hairy-limbed, but quite as light in colour as the Malays. They are an industrious and enterprising race, cultivating rice and vegetables, and indefatigable in their search after game, fish, tripang, pearls, and tortoise-shell. In the great island of Ceram there is also an indigenous race very similar to that of northern Gilolo. Born seems to contain 2 distinct races, a shorter, round-faced people with a Malay physiognomy, who may probably have come from Celebes by the way of the Sula Islands, and a taller, bearded race resembling that of Ceram. Far south of the Moluccas lies the island of Timor, inhabited by tribes much nearer to the true Papuan than those of the Moluccas. The Timorese of the interior are dusky brown or blackish, with bushy frizzled hair and the long Papuan nose. They are of medium height and rather slender figures. The universal dress is a long cloth twisted round the waist, the fringed ends of which hang below the knee. The people are said to be great thieves, and the tribes are always at war with each other, but they are not very courageous or bloodthirsty. The custom of taboo, called here pornali, is very general, fruit trees, houses, crop, and property of all kinds being protected from depredation by this ceremony, the reverence for which is very great. A palm branch struck across an open door, showing that the house is tabooed, is a more effectual guard against robbery than any amount of locks and bars. The houses in Timor are different from those of most of the other islands. They seem all roof, the thatch overhanging the low walls and reaching the ground, except where it is cut away for an entrance. In some parts of the west end of Timor, and on the little island of Samau, The houses more resemble those of the Hottentots, being egg-shaped, very small, and with a door only about 3 feet high. These are built on the ground, while those of the eastern districts are raised a few feet on posts. In their excitable disposition, loud voices, and fearless demeanour, the Timorese closely resemble the people of New Guinea. In the island west of Timor, as far as Flores and Sandalwood Island, a very similar race is found, which also extends eastward to Timor Lot, where the true Papuan race begins to appear. The small islands of Savu and Roti, however, to the west of Timor, are very remarkable in possessing a different and, in some respects, peculiar race. These people are very handsome, with good features, resembling in many characteristics the race produced by the mixture of the Hindu or Arab with the Malay. They are certainly distinct from the Timorese or Papuan races, and must be classed in the western rather than the eastern ethnological division of the archipelago. The whole of the great island of New Guinea, the Key and Aru Islands, with Mysol, Salwati, and Waigiou, are inhabited almost exclusively by the typical Papuans. I found no trace of any other tribes inhabiting the interior of New Guinea, but the coast people are in some places mixed with the browner races of the Moluccas. The same Papuan race seems to extend over the islands east of New Guinea as far as the Fijis. There remain to be noticed the black, woolly-haired races of the Philippines and the Malay Peninsula, the former called Negritos, and the latter Semangs. I have never seen these people myself, but from the numerous accurate descriptions of them that have been published, I have had no difficulty in satisfying myself that they have little affinity or resemblance to the Papuans, with which they have been hitherto associated. In most important characters, they differ more from the Papuan than they do from the Malay. They are dwarfs in stature, only averaging 4 feet 6 inches to 4 feet 8 inches high, or 8 inches less than the Malays, whereas the Papuans are decidedly taller than the Malays. The nose is invariably represented as small, flattened, or turned up at the apex, whereas the most universal character of the Papuan race is to have the nose prominent and large, with the apex produced downwards, as it is invariably represented in their own rude idols. The hair of these dwarfish races agrees with that of the Papuans, but so it does with that of the Negroes of Africa. The Negritos and the Semangs agree very closely in physical characteristics with each other, and with the Andaman Islanders, while they differ in a marked manner from every Papuan race. End of chapter 40, part 1. Chapter 40 of The Malay Archipelago, Volume 2, by Alfred Russel Wallace. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by deongines, Salt Lake City, Utah. Chapter 40, Part 2. A careful study of these varied races, comparing them with those of Eastern Asia, the Pacific Islands, and Australia, has led me to adopt a comparatively simple view as to their origin and affinities. If we draw a line, commencing to the east of the Philippine Islands, thence along the western coast of Gilolo, through the island of Boru, and curving round the west end of Mores, then bending back by Sandalwood Island to take in Roti, we shall divide the archipelago into 2 portions, the races of which have strongly marked distinctive peculiarities. This line will separate the Malayan and all the Asiatic races from the Papuans and all that inhabit the Pacific. And though along the line of junction intermigration and commixture have taken place, yet the division is on the whole almost as well defined and strongly contrasted as is the corresponding zoological division of the archipelago into an Indo-Malayan and Austro-Malayan region. I must briefly explain the reasons that have led me to consider this division of the oceanic races to be a true and natural one. The Malayan race, as a whole, undoubtedly very closely resembles the East Asian populations, from Siam to Manchuria. I was much struck with this when, in the island of Bali, I saw Chinese traders who had adopted the costume of that country, and who could then hardly be distinguished from Malays. And, on the other hand, I have seen natives of Java who, as far as physiognomy was concerned, would pass very well for Chinese. Then, again, we have the most typical of the Malayan tribes inhabiting a portion of the Asiatic continent itself, together with those great islands which, possessing the same species of large mammalia with the adjacent parts of the continent, have, in all probability, formed a connected portion of Asia during the human period. The Negritos are, no doubt, quite a distinct race from the Malay. But yet, as some of them inhabit a portion of the continent, and others the Andaman Islands in the Bay of Bengal, they must be considered to have had, in all probability, an Asiatic rather than a Polynesian origin. Now, turning to the eastern parts of the archipelago, I find, by comparing my own observations with those of the most trustworthy travelers and missionaries, that a race identical in all its chief features with the Papuan is found in all the islands as far east as the Fijis. Beyond this, the brown Polynesian race, or some intermediate type, is spread everywhere over the Pacific. The descriptions of these latter often agree exactly with the characters of the brown indigenes of Gilolo and Suram. It is to be especially remarked that the brown and the black Polynesian races closely resemble each other. Their features are almost identical, so that portraits of a New Zealander or Otaheitan will often serve accurately to represent a Papuan or Timorese, the darker color and more frizzly hair of the latter being the only differences. They are both tall races. They agree in their love of art and the style of their decorations. They are energetic, demonstrative, joyous, and laughter-loving, and in all these particulars they differ widely from the Malay. I believe, therefore, that the numerous intermediate forms that occur among the countless islands of the Pacific are not merely the result of a mixture of these races, but are, to some extent, truly intermediate or transitional, and that the brown and the black, the Papuan, the natives of Gilolo and Suram, the Fijian, the inhabitants of the Sandwich Islands, and those of New Zealand, are all varying forms of one great oceanic or Polynesian race. It is, however, quite possible, and perhaps probable, that the brown Polynesians were originally the produce of a mixture of Malays, or some lighter coloured Mongol race with the dark Papuans. But if so, the intermingling took place at such a remote epoch, and has been so assisted by the continued influence of physical conditions and of natural selection, leading to the preservation of a special type suited to those conditions, that it has become a fixed and stable race with no signs of mongrellism, and showing such a decided preponderance of Papuan character that it can best be classified as a modification of the Papuan type. The occurrence of a decided Malay element in the Polynesian languages has evidently nothing to do with any such ancient physical connection. It is altogether a recent phenomenon, originating in the roaming habits of the chief Malay tribes, and this is proved by the fact that we find actual modern words of the Malay and Javanese languages in use in Polynesia, so little disguised by peculiarities of pronunciation as to be easily recognizable, not mere Malay roots only to be detected by the elaborate researches of the philologist, as would certainly have been the case had their introduction been as remote as the origin of a very distinct race, a race as different from the Malay in mental and moral as it is in physical characters. As bearing upon this question, it is important to point out the harmony which exists between the line of separation of the human races of the archipelago and that of the animal productions of the same country, which I have already so fully explained and illustrated. The dividing lines do not, it is true, exactly agree, but I think it is a remarkable fact, and something more than a mere coincidence, that they should traverse the same district and approach each other so closely as they do. If, however, I am right in my supposition that the region where the dividing line of the Indo-Malayan and Austro-Malayan regions of zoology can now be drawn, was formerly occupied by a much wider sea than at present, and if man existed on the earth at that period, we shall see good reason why the races inhabiting the Asiatic and Pacific areas should now meet and partially intermingle in the vicinity of that dividing line. It has recently been maintained by Professor Huxley that the Papuans are more closely allied to the Negroes of Africa than to any other race. The resemblance, both in physical and mental characteristics, had often struck myself, but the difficulties in the way of accepting it as probable or possible have hitherto prevented me from giving full weight to those resemblances. Geographical, zoological, and ethnological considerations render it almost certain that if these two races ever had a common origin, it could only have been at a period far more remote than any which has yet been assigned to the antiquity of the human race. And even if their lenity could be proved, it would in no way affect my argument for the close affinity of the Papuan and Polynesian races, and the radical distinctness of both from the Malay. Polynesia is preeminently an area of subsidence, and its great widespread groups of coral reefs mark out the position of former continents and islands. The rich and varied, yet strangely isolated productions of Australia and New Guinea also indicate an extensive continent where such specialized forms were developed. The races of men now inhabiting these countries are, therefore, most probably the descendants of the races which inhabited these continents and islands. This is the most simple and natural supposition to make. And if we find any signs of direct affinity between the inhabitants of any other part of the world and those of Polynesia, it by no means follows that the latter were derived from the former. For as, when a Pacific continent existed, the whole geography of the earth's surface would probably be very different from what it is now, the present continents may not then have risen above the ocean, and, when they were formed at a subsequent epoch, may have derived some of their inhabitants from the Polynesian area itself. It is undoubtedly true that there are proofs of extensive migrations among the Pacific Islands, which have led to community of language from the Sandwich Group to New Zealand. But there are no proofs whatever of recent migration from any surrounding country to Polynesia, since there is no people to be found elsewhere sufficiently resembling the Polynesian race in their chief physical and mental characteristics. If the past history of these varied races is obscure and uncertain, the future is no less so. The true Polynesians, inhabiting the farthest isles of the Pacific, are no doubt doomed to an early extinction. But the more numerous Malay race seems well adapted to survive as the cultivator of the soil, even when his country and government have passed into the hands of Europeans. If the tide of colonization should be turned to New Guinea, there can be little doubt of the early extinction of the Papuan race. A warlike and energetic people, who will not submit to national slavery or to domestic servitude, must disappear before the white man as surely as do the wolf and the tiger. I have now concluded my task. I have given, in more or less detail, a sketch of my 8 years' wanderings among the largest and the most luxuriant islands which adorn our earth's surface. I have endeavoured to convey my impressions of their scenery, their vegetation, their animal productions, and their human inhabitants. I have dwelt at some length on the varied and interesting problems they offer to the student of nature. Before bidding my reader farewell, I wish to make a few observations on a subject of yet higher interest and deeper importance, which the contemplation of savage life has suggested, and on which I believe that the civilized can learn something from the savage man. We, most of us, believe that we, the higher races, have progressed and are progressing. If so, there must be some state of perfection, some ultimate goal, which we may never reach, but to which all true progress must bring nearer. What is this ideally perfect social state towards which mankind ever has been and still is tending? Our best thinkers maintain that it is a state of individual freedom and self-government, rendered possible by the equal development and just balance of the intellectual, moral, and physical parts of our nature, a state in which we shall each be so perfectly fitted for a social existence, by knowing what is right, and at the same time feeling an irresistible impulse to do what we know to be right, that all laws and all punishments shall be unnecessary. In such a state, every man would have a sufficiently well-balanced intellectual organization to understand the moral law in all its details, and would require no other motive but the free impulses of his own nature to obey that law. Now, it is very remarkable that among people in a very low stage of civilization we find some approach to such a perfect social state. I have lived with communities of savages in South America and in the East, who have no laws or law courts, but the public opinion of the village freely expressed. Each man scrupulously respects the rights of his fellow, and any infraction of those rights rarely or never takes place. In such a community all are nearly equal. There are none of those wide distinctions of education and ignorance, wealth and poverty, master and servant, which are the product of our civilization. There is none of that widespread division of labor, which, while it increases wealth, produces also conflicting interests. There is not that severe competition and struggle for existence, or for wealth, which the dense population of civilized countries inevitably creates. All incitements to great crimes are thus wanting, and petty ones are repressed, partly by the influence of public opinion, but chiefly by that natural sense of justice and of his neighbour's right, which seems to be, in some degree, inherent in every race of man. Now, although we have progressed vastly beyond the savage state in intellectual achievements, we have not advanced equally in morals. It is true that among those classes who have no wants that cannot be easily supplied, and among whom public opinion has great influence, the rights of others are fully respected. It is true, also, that we have vastly extended the sphere of those rights, and include within them all the brotherhood of man. But it is not too much to say that the mass of our populations have not at all advanced beyond the savage code of morals, and have in many cases sunk below it. A deficient morality is the great blot of modern civilization, and the greatest hindrance to true progress. During the last century, and especially in the last 30 years, our intellectual and material advancement has been too quickly achieved for us to reap the full benefit of it. Our mastery over the forces of nature has led to a rapid growth of population and a vast accumulation of wealth, but these have brought with them such an amount of poverty and crime, and have fostered the growth of so much sordid feeling and so many fierce passions, that it may well be questioned whether the mental and moral status of our population has not on the average been lowered, and whether the evil has not overbalanced the good. Compared with our wondrous progress in physical science and its practical applications, our system of government, of administering justice, of national education, and our whole social and moral organization, remains in a state of barbarism. And, if we continue to devote our chief energies to the utilizing of our knowledge, the laws of nature, with the view of still further extending our commerce and our wealth, the evils which necessarily accompany these, when too eagerly pursued, may increase to such gigantic dimensions as to be beyond our power to alleviate. We should now clearly recognize the fact that the wealth and knowledge and culture of the few do not constitute civilization, and do not of themselves advance us towards the perfect social state. Our vast manufacturing system, our gigantic commerce, our crowded towns and cities, support and continually renew a mass of human misery and crime absolutely greater than has ever existed before. They create and maintain, in lifelong labor an ever-increasing army, whose lot is the more hard to bear by contrast with the pleasures, the comforts, and the luxury which they see everywhere around them, but which they can never hope to enjoy, and who, in this respect, are worse off than the savage in the midst of his tribe. This is not a result to boast of, or to be satisfied with, and until there is a more general recognition of this failure of our civilization, resulting mainly from our neglect to train and develop more thoroughly the sympathetic feelings and moral faculties of our nature, and to allow them a larger share of influence in our legislation, our commerce, and our whole social organization, we shall never, as regards the whole community, attain to any real or important superiority over the better class of savages. This is the lesson I have been taught by my observations of uncivilized man. I now bid my readers farewell. Note: those who believe that our social condition approaches perfection will think the above word harsh and exaggerated, but it seems to me the only word that can be truly applied to us. We are the richest country in the world, and yet 1/20th of our population are parish paupers, and 1/30th known criminals. Add to these the criminals who escape detection, and the poor who live mainly on private charity, which, according to Dr. Hawksley, expends 7 millions sterling annually in London alone, and we may be sure that more than 1/10th of our population are actually paupers and criminals. Both these classes we keep idle or at unproductive labor, and each criminal costs us annually in our prisons more than the wages of an honest agricultural laborer. We allow over 100,000 persons known to have no means of subsistence but by crime to remain at large and prey upon the community, and many thousand children to grow up before our eyes in ignorance and vice, to supply trained criminals for the next generation. This in a country which boasts of its rapid increase in wealth, of its enormous commerce and gigantic manufactures, of its mechanical skill and scientific knowledge, of its high civilization and its pure Christianity. I can but term a state of social barbarism. We also boast of our love of justice, and that the law protects rich and poor alike, yet we retain money fines as a punishment, and make the very first steps to obtain justice a matter of expense, in both cases a barbarous injustice or denial of injustice to the poor. Again, our laws render it possible that by mere neglect of a legal form, and contrary to its own wish and intention, a man's property may all go to a stranger, and his children be left destitute. Such cases have happened through the operation of the laws of inheritance of landed property, and that such unnatural injustice is possible among us shows that we are in a state of social barbarism. One more example to justify my use of the term, and I have done. We permit absolute possession of the soil of our country, with no legal rights of existence on the soil, to the vast majority who do not possess it. A great landholder may legally convert his whole property into a forest or a hunting ground, and expel every human being who has hitherto lived upon it. In a thickly populated country like England, where every acre has its owner and its occupier, this is a power of legally destroying his fellow creatures, and that such a power should exist and be exercised by individuals, in however small a degree, indicates that, as regards true social science, we are still in a state of barbarism. End of Chapter 40, Part 2. End of the Malay Archipelago, Volume 2, by Alfred Russel Wallace.